They say that every dish tells a story. A pinch of saffron whispers of distant markets. A sprig of rosemary speaks of sun-drenched hillsides. But what if a recipe could tell a different kind of story? A story of secrets best left unearthed, of sorrows that curdle the blood, and of a hunger so profound, so absolute, that it could consume a soul. This is the story of Oakhaven and the widow who fed its people. But what she served them was not nourishment. It was an ending. Before her, Oakhaven was a town drowning in silence. It lay nestled in a valley carved by a forgotten glacier, a place the sun seemed hesitant to visit. The woods that crowded its edges were ancient and possessive, their branches knitted together so tightly they formed a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The trees were wrong, somehow. Their bark was too dark, their shapes too gnarled, like arthritic fingers clawing at the sky. The air itself was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the subtle metallic tang of secrets. The people of Oakhaven were much like the trees. They were stoic, insular folk, their roots sunk deep into the sour soil of the valley. They spoke in clipped sentences and measured glances, their trust a currency earned over generations, not freely given. Strangers were a rarity, and those who did pass through were watched with a collective, silent suspicion until the road carried them away again. Oakhaven did not welcome the outside world. It endured it. It was a place where stories ended, not where they began. And then she arrived. She came on the cusp of autumn, when the perpetual dampness of the valley began to carry a knife's-edge chill. She arrived not with the clatter of a carriage or the noise of a motor-car, but like a wisp of smoke, a rumour made flesh. One day the old Blackwood cottage at the edge of the woods was empty. A dark, gaping moat, arch of a house that children dared each other to approach, and the next, a thin ribbon of smoke was rising from its chimney, pale and fragile against the bruised twilight sky. Her name was Ilara, the widow Blackwood. She was a vision from a world Oakhaven had only read about in dusty, forgotten books. She was tall and slender, with hair the colour of polished jet, and eyes that held the deep, quiet grey of a winter sea. But it was her stillness that was most unnerving. She moved with a liquid grace that seemed to waste no energy, her hands never fidgeting, her gaze never darting. When she looked at you, it was with an unnerving totality, as if she were not just seeing you, but reading the marrow in your bones. The story she offered was simple, smooth as a river stone. Her husband, a naval man, had been taken by the sea. A tragic accident. She sought only peace, a quiet place to tend her garden and her grief. She spoke of him with a serene, almost beatific sadness that was both heartbreaking and impenetrable. There were no ragged sobs, no flashes of anger at a cruel fate. There was only a placid, sorrowful acceptance that seemed almost rehearsed. Oakhaven, for all its suspicion, had a weakness for tragedy. It was a language they understood. They watched her from behind their lace curtains, murmuring amongst themselves. They saw her tending the derelict garden behind the Blackwood cottage, her slender fingers coaxing life from soil that had been barren for a generation. They saw her airing out the house, sweeping away the ghosts of the past with a calm, methodical purpose. They saw a woman remaking her world, and against their better judgment, they began to soften. Her first offering was a loaf of bread. She brought it to the parsonage, a peace offering to the village's spiritual heart. Reverend Michael, a man whose faith was as sturdy and weathered as the ancient oak, in the churchyard, accepted it with a grateful nod. The bread was still warm, its crust a perfect burnished gold, and it smelled of herbs he couldn't quite name. Later that evening he would share it with his wife, and they would both agree they had never tasted anything quite like it. It was more than just bread. It felt like a memory of home, a home you'd never actually had but suddenly yearned for, with a desperate, aching nostalgia. This was Ilara's method. This was her key. She unlocked the rusted heart of Oakhaven, not with words, but with flavors. A pot of stew left on the doorstep of a family with a sick child, a jar of preserves for the lonely schoolteacher, a small, perfect cake for a neighbor's birthday. Each gift was an embassy, a declaration of quiet friendship. Her creations were sublime. The flavors were complex, deep and resonant, lingering on the palate long after the last bite was gone. They tasted of comfort. They tasted of kindness. They tasted of absolution. And so, the villagers began to speak her name, not with suspicion, but with a kind of reverence. The widow Blackwood, the kind woman from the cottage, the one who could bake sunshine into a pie crust and distill solace into a broth. She asked for nothing in return. She attended church services, sitting quietly in the back pew, her grey eyes fixed on the stained glass window. She smiled her serene, gentle smile and listened more than she spoke. She learned their names, their children's names, their secret worries, and their quiet hopes. She became a part of the village's tapestry, weaving herself in so deftly, so seamlessly, that it soon became difficult to remember a time when she hadn't been there. But there were shadows. There were always shadows where Ilara was concerned, little inconsistencies, small, discordant notes in her symphony of kindness. Old man Hemlock, who'd lived his 80 years in the valley and knew the woods better than his own wrinkled hands, swore that no birds sang in the trees around the Blackwood cottage. He'd sit on his porch, in the early morning, listening to the chorus of the waking forest, and note the circle of profound silence that seemed to radiate from her property line. It was, he'd mutter to anyone who'd listen, unnatural. The blacksmith's son, a boy of 10, claimed he'd seen her talking to the plants in her garden. Not just talking, but whispering, her face so close to the leaves of a strange, dark-leafed herb that her lips almost brushed against them. He said the plants seemed to lean toward her, to listen. His father told him to stop telling such fanciful lies. And then there was Martha Gable, the village's unofficial historian and chief purveyor of gossip. Martha had seen it all and held a healthy skepticism for anything that seemed too good to be true. Ilara's perfect kindness was to Martha an unopened letter she was dying to read. Her chance came one Tuesday afternoon. Ilara appeared at her door, holding a small lattice-topped pie. "For you, Mrs. Gable," Ilara said, her voice a soft melody. "I heard you were feeling under the weather. A little rhubarb and ginger to warm the bones." Martha, surprised by the gesture, invited her in. As she placed the pie on her kitchen table, her old tomcat, Cinder, a creature of pure feral animosity, who tolerated no one but Martha, slunk into the room. He stopped dead, his back arched, a low, guttural hiss vibrating in his chest. His yellow eyes were fixed not on Ilara, who stood smiling by the door, but on the pie. "My, what a fierce guardian you have," Ilara chuckled. Cinder took a tentative step forward, his nose twitching. He sniffed the air near the pie and then recoiled as if he'd been struck. He hissed again, a sound of pure revulsion, and bolted from the room, disappearing under a dusty armchair. Martha stared after him, bewildered. "I have never, in all his 15 years, seen him do that. He must be getting senile." She turned back to Ilara, and for a single fleeting second the serene mask slipped. The smile on Ilara's face didn't vanish, but it tightened, becoming something sharp and brittle. A flicker of something cold and ancient, something utterly devoid of warmth, passed through her grey eyes. It was a look of profound, calculating annoyance. It was there, and then it was gone, so quickly that Martha wondered if the dim kitchen light had played a trick on her. "Silly creature," Ilara said, her voice once again smooth as cream. "It must be the ginger. Some animals have a strong aversion to it." The explanation was plausible. It was reasonable. But Martha couldn't shake the image of that momentary coldness, the feeling of a placid lake freezing over in an instant. She thanked Ilara for the pie, but after the widow had left, Martha stood looking at it for a very long time. It smelled divine. It was a perfect, beautiful thing. And yet, she could not bring herself to take a single bite. She gave it to the pigs. This was the nature of the unease that began to curl at the edges of Oakhaven's consciousness. It was a thing of moments, of feelings, of things that could be easily explained away. No one spoke of it directly. To do so would be to seem ungrateful, even mad. How could you question a woman who brought you soup when you were sick? How could you harbor suspicion for someone whose only apparent crime was an excess of generosity? And so the whispers, when they happened at all, were quiet and died quickly. Ilara's garden was a source of constant wonder, and for a few, quiet dread. While the rest of Oakhaven struggled with the valley's sour, grudging soil, her garden thrived with an almost violent vitality. The flowers were too bright, their colors too saturated. Her vegetables grew to prodigious sizes, her pumpkins swollen and orange as a harvest moon, her tomatoes a voluptuous red. And amidst the familiar rows of beans and corn, there were other plants, herbs with dark, serrated leaves and pale, bell-shaped flowers that seemed to drink the light. Plants no one recognized. When asked about them, Ilara would smile her gentle smile. "Old remedies, things my grandmother taught me." She would sometimes use these strange herbs in her cooking, and the flavors they produced were intoxicating, unlike anything the villagers had ever tasted. They were earthy and complex, with notes that were at once bitter and sweet, leaving a strange, lingering warmth in the belly. Another peculiarity was her apparent lack of appetite. She was the architect of feasts, the creator of the most desired food in the valley, yet no one ever saw her eat. At village potlucks, her dishes would be the first to vanish, devoured by eager hands. But Ilara herself would stand aside, a cup of water in her hand, watching the others eat with that serene, unreadable expression on her face. If pressed, she would murmur, "Oh, I nibbled while I was cooking. My appetite is quite small." It was a reasonable excuse, yet when offered repeatedly over months, it began to feel less like an explanation and more like an evasion. It was as if she were a master perfumer who could no longer abide the scents she created. The story of her husband, the man lost to the sea, remained her cornerstone. It was the foundation of her tragic, gentle persona. She spoke of him fondly, but vaguely. His name was Arthur. He loved poetry and the open ocean. His death had left a hole in her heart that only quiet contemplation could fill. It was a sad, romantic tale, and the women of the village would pat her hand in sympathy, their hearts aching for the beautiful, lonely widow. But Oakhaven had a postmaster, a man named Silas Abernathy. Silas was a meticulous man, a creature of habit and order. His Ald was one of stamps, letters, and the predictable rhythms of the mail. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. One rainy afternoon, sorting through a bundle of mail that had been delayed by a washed-out road, a damp page from an old newspaper, used as wrapping for a parcel, tore away. It was from a city paper, months old, from a part of the country hundreds of miles away. Silas would normally have tossed it, but a headline caught his eye. It was a small article, buried in the back pages. "Local businessman vanishes without a trace." Silas was about to discard it when the name in the article leapt out at him. Arthur Blackwood. His heart gave a little jolt. It was a common enough name, he told himself. A coincidence. But he kept reading. The article described Arthur Blackwood not as a naval man who loved the sea, but as a wealthy investor, a man known for his ruthless business practices and his collection of rare books. a man who had made many enemies. He hadn't vanished near the ocean. He had disappeared from his locked study in his city home, leaving behind a half-finished glass of brandy and a faint, unidentifiable, earthy smell in the air. The authorities suspected foul play, perhaps a business rival, but they had no leads. The man had simply ceased to be. The article included a small, grainy photograph. It was hard to make out the details, but the set of the man's jaw, the shape of his eyes, it was plausible. Silas Abernathy felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He looked at the date on the newspaper. It was from the week before Elara Blackwood had arrived in Oakhaven. He quickly hid the clipping, his hands trembling slightly. What did it mean? He thought of her story, the tale of the heroic naval husband swallowed by the waves. A simple, tragic narrative. This story, the one on the crumbling newsprint, was something else entirely. It was messy. It was suspicious. It was a lie. Silas was not a brave man. His first instinct was to burn the clipping, to forget he ever saw it. Who was he to challenge the story of the kindest woman in Oakhaven? Who would believe him? They would call him a troublemaker, a malicious gossip monger. He could already imagine the cold shoulders in the general store, the sudden silence when he entered the tavern. To accuse Elara would be to accuse the village of a collective foolishness, and Oakhaven did not take kindly to being made the fool. So he said nothing, but the knowledge was a stone in his gut. Every time he saw her now, his blood ran cold. He saw the lie behind her serene grey eyes. He heard the falsehood in her soft, melodic voice. Her kindness, once a source of comfort, now seemed like a grotesque masquerade. What was she hiding? And why had she chosen this remote, forgotten valley as her stage? He started to watch her, discreetly at first, then with a growing obsession. He noted the people she visited, the herbs she picked from the silent woods at twilight, the way she never ever seemed to sleep. He would wake in the dead of night to see a single candle burning in the window of the Blackwood cottage, a lonely, unblinking eye in the oppressive darkness. The weight of the secret began to take its toll. Silas grew pale and thin. His hands developed a persistent tremor. He was startled by sudden noises. He began to look over his shoulder as he walked home from the post office, convinced that a pair of calm grey eyes were watching him from the shadows. The lie he was keeping felt like a poison he had swallowed, and it was slowly eating him from the inside out. He tried to tell his wife once. He sat her down at their kitchen table, the newspaper clipping clutched in his sweaty palm. "Mary," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I have to tell you something about the widow." But just as he started, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Elara. She stood on their doorstep, holding a covered basket, her face a mask of gentle concern. "Forgive the intrusion," she said softly, "but I saw the light on, and I thought I heard raised voices. Is everything all right, Silas? You haven't seemed yourself lately." Silas stared at her, his mouth agape. It was as if she had heard his thoughts, as if she knew the exact words he had been about to speak. The clipping in his hand suddenly felt like a hot coal. "We're fine, Elara. Thank you," his wife said, recovering first. "The mister is just tired, working too hard." Elara's gaze lingered on Silas for a moment longer than was comfortable. Her eyes were full of a deep, disquieting sympathy. "You must take care of yourself," she murmured. "This valley can be hard on a troubled mind." She held out the basket. "I brought you some of my mushroom broth. It's an old family recipe, very restorative for the nerves." The next day, Silas Abernathy did not open the post office. He was in his bed, struck down by a violent fever and a debilitating weakness that had come on in the night. He was delirious, muttering about locked rooms and the smell of damp earth. The village doctor was baffled. It was unlike any sickness he had ever seen. The man was simply fading, wasting away as if some vital part of him were being systematically erased. Word spread through Oakhaven like a contagion. Poor Silas Abernathy. Such a good, steady man. The village held its breath, praying for his recovery. And of course, the first person to offer her services was the widow. Elara Blackwood arrived at the Abernathy house as the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley. She carried a steaming tureen, a fragrant cloud rising from it that filled the small, worried home with an aroma that was at once intoxicating and deeply unsettling. It smelled of wild mushrooms, dark herbs, and something else, something savory and deeply familiar that no one could quite place. She moved. Dee to Silas's bedside, her expression one of pure, benevolent compassion. Mary Abernathy, her eyes red-rimmed with worry, watched with desperate hope. Elara dipped a silver spoon into the thick, dark broth. "This will help," she whispered, her voice a hypnotic balm. "It will give him strength. It will quiet his mind." She raised the spoon to Silas's pale, trembling lips. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment a flicker of lucid terror crossed his face as he looked at the woman leaning over him, a dark angel with a silver spoon. He recognized her. He remembered the lie. He opened his mouth, not to receive the broth, but to scream, to warn them all. But no sound came out. Only a weak, rattling gasp. Elara's smile did not waver. It was serene, patient, and utterly terrifying. She gently nudged the spoon past his lips, her movements as calm and practiced as a priestess administering a final sacrament. He knew her first lie, the secret of the man who hadn't drowned. But what poor Silas Abernathy couldn't have known, as the first drop of that rich, dark broth touched his tongue, was that some truths are not meant to be spoken. They are meant to be served. And the widow's most carefully guarded secret, the one that tasted so very, very sweet, was that she never let her ingredients go to waste. Is a cure still a cure if it silences the sickness by silencing the man? This is the question that should have been whispered through the crooked lanes of Oakhaven in the days that followed Silas Abernathy's affliction, but it was not. In a town starved of miracles, no one was willing to look too closely at the nature of a gift. They only saw the result. And the result was, by all accounts, a marvel. Silas Abernathy did not die. He recovered. The word itself seems too simple, too clean for what transpired. He did not fight his way back to health, battling a fever until it broke. Rather, the sickness seemed to recede, to be absorbed back into him, leaving an unnerving calm in its wake. He rose from his bed 3 days after Elara's visit, his skin no longer pale with fever, but with a waxy, translucent quality. His hands no longer trembled. His eyes, once sharp and inquisitive, were now placid and calm, like deep, undisturbed pools of water. He returned to his post office, sorting the mail with the same meticulous care as before. But the man was gone. The old Silas, the one with the furrowed brow of worry and the perpetually curious glance, had been replaced by a hollow, pleasant shell. He spoke when spoken to, his voice a flat monotone. He smiled, a vague, distant curving of the lips. But the fire of his obsession, the terrible knowledge that had been consuming him, was extinguished. His wife, Mary, wept with gratitude. "It's Elara's broth," she told everyone in the market square. "A miracle. It calmed the fever and gave him back his peace." And when someone asked Silas about the widow, he would simply blink slowly and say, "A very kind woman. She brought me some soup." There was no mention of a newspaper clipping, of a vanished businessman, of a lie. The part of his mind that had held that dangerous secret had been soothed into oblivion. The cure had been precise. It had not healed the body so much as it had excised a troublesome piece of the soul. He was a man who had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had politely handed him back, empty. The legend of the widow's secret recipe was born in the ashes of Silas Abernathy's memory. Her mushroom broth was no longer just a kind gesture. It was a potent elixir, a whispered-about cure for ailments both physical and spiritual. The village's fascination bloomed, an unhealthy and desperate flower. People no longer waited for Ilara's charity. They began to seek it out. It started subtly. A farmer with a persistent ache in his joints would stop her on the road. "That broth you gave Silas," he'd begin, his hat twisting in his hands. "I don't suppose—" A mother whose child was plagued by nightmares would knock on the cottage door. "Forgive me for bothering you, Widow Blackwood, but I heard—" Ilara, in her infinite grace, always obliged. She would listen with that deep, unnerving stillness, her grey eyes filled with a profound understanding. She would nod slowly. "The body and the mind are connected," she would say, her voice a gentle murmur. "Sometimes one must be quieted to heal the other." Her kitchen became the new heart of Oakhaven. The aroma that drifted from her chimney was a constant, tantalizing promise of relief. It was a complex and shifting scent, sometimes earthy and deep, other times sharp with unfamiliar herbs, but always, always intoxicating. To walk past the Blackwood cottage was to feel a sudden hollow ache in the pit of your stomach, a craving you didn't know you had. Those who were gifted a taste of her cooking spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. The experience was more than just gustatory. It was transformative. A bite of her venison pie, they said, could make a man forget a lifetime of failures. A spoonful of her chilled berry soup could soothe the rawest edges of grief. It was food that didn't just fill the belly. It seemed to reach into the dark, cluttered corners of the mind and tidy them up, sweeping away anxieties, regrets, and inconvenient truths. The feeling was one of profound, blissful peace. A warm, narcotic calm that spread from the stomach through the limbs, loosening the knots of tension in the shoulders and smoothing the worried furrows of brow. For a few hours after eating one of Ilara's meals, the world seemed simpler, softer. The oppressive woods seemed less menacing. The perpetual grey sky seemed a little brighter. One's own small, troubled life felt distant, like a story about someone else. But there was a price for this peace. It was never spoken of, but it was felt. After the euphoria faded, a strange lethargy would set in, a quiet, listless apathy. Ambition cooled. Passions dwindled. The sharp, vibrant colours of life muted to a comfortable uniform grey. The farmers who ate her stew to soothe their aching joints found they no longer minded the weeds choking their fields. The women who drank her herbal teas to calm their nerves found they no longer had much to say at all. Oakhaven, already a town steeped in silence, began to fall into a deeper, more profound slumber. The tavern grew quieter, the boisterous arguments over politics and prices replaced by a shared, placid silence. The children's games in the street seemed less energetic, their laughter less piercing. The village was being sedated, one delicious, unforgettable meal at a time. The illness the recipe was tied to was not a fever or a plague. It was a slow, gentle erosion of the self. Not everyone fell under the spell, or rather, not everyone was willing to pay the price. Evelyn Reed was the village schoolteacher. She had come to Oakhaven 2 years prior, an outsider armed with books, a fierce belief in the power of a curious mind, and a quiet intolerance for willful ignorance. She was a woman of logic and observation, and she observed the change creeping over Oakhaven with a growing sense of dread. She saw it first in her pupils. They became less inquisitive. Their hands were slower to rise with questions, their eyes quicker to glaze over during lessons. When she spoke of distant lands or scientific wonders, she was met with a placid indifference, where once there had been sparks of excitement. They were healthy, well-fed children, but the light of their curiosity was dimming. Then she noticed it in their parents. At parent-teacher meetings, they would nod and smile, their gazes distant. They praised her work in the same vague, pleasant tones they used for everything else. Their concerns, once specific and sharp, a son's trouble with arithmetic, a daughter's shyness, had dissolved into a general nebulous contentment. "He's a good boy," they'd say. "She's happy enough." Evelyn was not a gossip. She dealt in facts. And the facts were these. The children were becoming duller, their parents more passive, and the one common denominator, the new and celebrated centre of village life, was the widow and her miraculous cooking. She had tasted it herself, just once. At a village picnic, Elara had brought a magnificent tiered cake, adorned with crystallized violets and shimmering with a delicate sugary glaze. Evelyn, succumbing to social pressure, had accepted a small slice. The taste was sublime, a symphony of almond, apricot, and something else, a floral, almost narcotic note she couldn't identify. And then the feeling had come, a warm, wonderful wave of utter contentment. For a glorious hour, the anxieties that perpetually gnawed at her, the leaky roof of the schoolhouse, the dwindling supply of textbooks, her own profound loneliness, simply vanished. It was the most peaceful she had felt since arriving in Oakhaven. And it terrified her. The peace felt unnatural, unearned. It felt like a lie. When the feeling subsided hours later, leaving behind a dull headache and a sense of profound emptiness, her fear crystallized into suspicion. Peace should not be a consumable. Contentment should not come on a plate. She began to watch Elara. She charted the widow's movements, her comings and goings, with the same meticulous detail she used for her lesson plans. She noted who received baskets of food and how their demeanor would change in the following days. She saw the carpenter, a man known for his fiery temper, become docile and compliant after a week of Elara's strengthening stews. She saw the seamstress, a woman whose sharp tongue was the stuff of legend, grow quiet and meek after being treated with the widow's soothing pastries for her headaches. Elara was not merely feeding the village, she was curating it. She was weeding out the difficult emotions, the inconvenient personalities. She was transforming Oakhaven into a town of placid, smiling automatons, and she was doing it with kindness, a spoon, and a smile. The second incident that solidified Evelyn's fears concerned a young woman named Clara, the blacksmith's eldest daughter. Clara was a passionate, dramatic girl, prone to flights of fancy and deep melancholy. She had fallen desperately in love with a travelling merchant, and when he left the valley without so much as a goodbye, her heart had shattered. She took to her bed, refusing to eat, weeping with a grief so profound it shook the entire village. Her parents were at their wits' end. The doctor offered laudanum. The parson offered prayers. Neither had any effect. And then, inevitably, someone suggested the widow. Elara arrived at the blacksmith's house not with a savoury broth, but with a small, beautifully decorated box. Inside were a dozen tiny confections, small squares of what looked like spun sugar and candied fruit, each one a perfect, glittering jewel. "Sorrow is a bitter thing," Elara said to Clara's parents, her voice a comforting whisper. "It must be countered with sweetness. Let her have one of these whenever the darkness comes. It will remind her that life still holds sweetness of its own." Clara, in her despair, ate one, and then another. Within 2 days, her weeping stopped. She rose from her bed, her eyes dry. Her dramatic, all-consuming grief was gone, but so was everything else. Fire that had defined her, her passionate love of poetry, her fierce laughter, her vibrant anger, it had all been extinguished. She was calm. She was quiet. She helped her mother with the chores, her face a placid, empty canvas. The village called it another miracle. The blacksmith, a man of few words, looked at his placid, hollowed-out daughter, and for the first time, a seed of doubt began to sprout in his practical heart. Evelyn Reed, hearing the news, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She knew with a certainty that defied proof that this was the same foul medicine that had been administered to Silas Abernathy, merely in a different form. It was a cure for the inconvenient parts of being human. Evelyn knew she had to do something. But what? To speak out would be to brand herself a heretic. The village was addicted to Ilara's comfort. They would defend their sweet-natured saviour with a ferocity she could not hope to overcome. She had no proof, only observations, patterns, and a deep, intuitive dread. She needed something concrete, a secret ingredient, a hidden truth. She decided to focus on the source. Ilara's garden was an enigma, but it was in plain sight. It was the woods that held the true mystery. The villagers, a superstitious lot, largely avoided the dark woods, especially the older parts. But Ilara walked them freely. Evelyn had seen her many times, a slender, grey-cloaked figure disappearing among the gnarled trunks at dusk, always carrying an empty basket, and returning an hour later with it full of strange herbs, roots, and fungi. This was where the unique, intoxicating flavors came from. This was the source of her power. For a week, Evelyn tried to follow her, but Ilara moved with a quiet, preternatural awareness. She seemed to sense she was being watched, always changing her path, doubling back, or simply vanishing into the gloom, as if the trees themselves had swallowed her. It was useless. Trying to track Ilara in her own domain was like trying to track a shadow, so Evelyn changed her tactics. She stopped trying to follow Ilara and started trying to think like her. She observed the days Ilara went foraging. It wasn't random. There was a pattern tied to the phases of the moon and the turning of the weather. She realized Ilara always went out on the eve of a new moon, when the darkness was at its most absolute. A new moon was 2 days away. Evelyn prepared herself. She dressed in dark clothes, rubbed dirt on her face to hide the pale glint of her skin, and packed a small satchel with water and a piece of dry bread. Not from the widow. She would not follow Ilara from the cottage. Instead, she would go into the woods early, find a place to hide along the path she suspected Ilara took, and wait. The day of the new moon arrived, cloaked in a thick, oppressive fog that clung to the valley floor. The world was reduced to shades of grey, and sounds were muffled and distorted. It was the perfect evening for secrets. Evelyn slipped out of the schoolhouse as dusk began to bleed into the sky and made her way into the woods. She found a spot she had scouted earlier, a thicket of thorns overlooking a faint game trail that led deeper into the oldest part of the forest, a place the villagers called the Whisperwood. She settled in, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and she waited. Hours passed. The darkness became total, a physical presence that seemed to press in on all sides. The woods were alive with faint, unsettling noises. The snap of a twig, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, the low moan of the wind through the twisted branches. Evelyn fought back her fear, focusing on her purpose. And then she saw it. A light. A single, small point of light, like a captured star, moving steadily through the trees. It was Ilara's lantern. She was coming. Evelyn shrank back into the thorns, scarcely daring to breathe. Ilara passed, Ed by her hiding spot, a phantom in the gloom. She moved with an unnerving silence, her feet making no sound on the damp earth. She was not carrying her usual foraging basket. Her hands were empty. Evelyn's brow furrowed in confusion. If she wasn't here to gather herbs, then what was she doing? Driven by a terrible curiosity, Evelyn gave her 100 yards and then began to follow, moving from tree to tree, a shadow tracking a ghost. Ilara did not follow the trail. She veered off into the deepest, most ancient part of the Whisperwood, a place where the trees grew in a tight, suffocating circle around a small, unnatural clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a single monolithic oak, a tree so old its bark was black, and its branches were like the arms of a skeletal god. The ground around it was strangely bare, devoid of the usual carpet of leaves and moss. The air here was cold, dead, and utterly still. Evelyn watched, her blood turning to ice, as Alara stopped at the base of the ancient oak. The lantern light cast her long, dancing shadow against the trunk. The widow knelt, placing the lantern on the ground beside her. And then she began to dig. She used her bare hands, scooping away the dark, loamy soil with a slow, rhythmic purpose. It was not the action of a woman searching for roots or tubers. It was the careful, deliberate excavation of a specific spot. It was the act of someone uncovering something that had been intentionally buried. After a few moments, her fingers struck something hard. A dull, wooden thud. Carefully, Alara cleared the remaining earth away, revealing the lid of a small, dark wooden box, bound in what looked like tarnished brass. It was about the size of a shoebox, and it seemed to absorb the lantern light, radiating an aura of profound wrongness. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She watched as Alara produced a small, ornate key from a pocket in her cloak. She fitted it into a lock on the front of the box. There was a soft, metallic click that echoed unnaturally in the dead silence of the clearing. Slowly, reverently, Alara lifted the lid. A light spilled out from within the box. It was not the warm yellow glow of a candle or the bright, clean light of a lamp. It was a faint, sickly, phosphorescent green, the color of decay and deep-sea bioluminescence. It bathed Alara's face in its ghostly radiance, and the expression she wore was not one of kindness or serene compassion. It was a look of rapturous, hungry devotion. Her gentle smile was still there, but in the spectral green light, it looked like the ecstatic grin of a wolf about to feast. What kind of recipe requires an ingredient that must be locked away and buried in the unhallowed earth of the Whisperwood? What secret flavor is seasoned with soil from a place that feels so very much like a grave? Evelyn could not answer. She could only watch in silent, abject terror as the widow reached into the glowing box to procure the secret to her next perfect, unforgettable meal. There are ingredients the earth provides freely: the wild garlic, the sweet berry, the savory mushroom. And then there are those the earth tries to keep buried, secrets locked in root and rot, flavors that carry the bitter tang of oblivion. What terrible, unspeakable hunger would drive a cook to rob the soil of its darkest mysteries, to garnish a dish with something that flickers with the light of the grave itself? Evelyn Reed did not have an answer. She only had the searing, hellish image of the spectral green light and the widow's rapturous smile. Terror was a living thing inside her, a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs. She had to flee. But to run would be to make a sound, and a sound in this dead, silent clearing would be a death sentence. She was a trespasser in a witch's pantry, and she knew with a certainty that went beyond logic that discovery meant she would become just another ingredient. She backed away. Inch by agonizing inch, her muscles screaming with the effort of silence. Every rustle of a leaf under her boot sounded like a thunderclap in her own ears. The thorns she had hidden in now clawed at her clothes, trying to hold her back, to offer her up as a sacrifice. She did not dare turn her back on the scene. She could still see Alara, a dark silhouette against the unholy glow, her head bowed as if in prayer, her hands busy with something inside the box. Evelyn finally reached the relative cover of a thick yew tree, and turning, she ran. She ran blindly, stumbling over roots and crashing through unseen branches, the sound of her own ragged breath and hammering heart drowning out the noises of the forest. She did not stop until the first familiar lights of Oakhaven pierced the gloom, a feeble but welcome shore in an ocean of darkness. She bolted the door of the schoolhouse behind her and collapsed against it, trembling uncontrollably. She had seen it. A truth so monstrous, it had no place in the rational world she inhabited. Ilara was not just a charlatan using strange herbs. She was not just a liar with a hidden past. She was something other, something ancient and unholy, communing with a power that slept beneath the roots of the world. The next day, the widow's routine was unchanged. She worked in her garden, she swept her porch, she smiled her serene and gentle smile to those who passed by. There was no sign of her nocturnal ritual, no trace of grave dirt beneath her fingernails. It was this normality that was the most terrifying part. The monster was wearing the face of their kindest neighbor. Later that afternoon, Ilara emerged from her cottage carrying a small crystalline jar. Inside was a shimmering emerald-green conserve, dotted with what looked like tiny seeds. It caught the weak afternoon light and seemed to glow with a faint luminescence of its own, Evelite. En watched from her schoolhouse window as Ilara walked down the lane, her steps measured and purposeful. She was heading for the Thatcher cottage. The Thatchers were a family clinging to the edge of Oakhaven society. John Thatcher was a woodcutter, a proud, powerful man with a booming laugh and a deep-seated skepticism for anything he couldn't chop down or hold in his hands. He openly scoffed at the villagers' growing reverence for the widow. "She's just a woman with a spice rack," he'd say in the tavern. "You're all a bunch of gossiping hens." His wife, Alice, was his opposite, a frail, anxious woman, as delicate as a dried flower, who lived in the shadow of her husband's formidable presence. They had one child, a small, quiet boy named Thomas. 2 days prior, John Thatcher had been felling a large oak when a rotten branch, a widowmaker they called it, had snapped and fallen, shattering his leg. He was now laid up in his cottage, his pride as broken as his bone, his temper a foul storm cloud that filled the small home. This, Evelyn realized with a sickening lurch, was the opening Ilara had been waiting for. A household full of pain, frustration, and fear. A proud man brought low. A perfect stage for one of her miracles. Alice Thatcher answered the widow's knock, her face etched with worry. Evelyn was too far away to hear the words, but she could imagine them. The soft, melodic voice offering comfort. The gentle words of sympathy. The offering of the glowing jar. A special recipe, she was probably saying. To aid in healing. To soothe the nerves and restore the spirit. Evelyn saw Alice accept the jar, her hands trembling with gratitude. She saw the frail woman offer a weak, hopeful smile. She saw Ilara pat the woman's arm before turning and walking away, her task complete. That night, a terrible premonition fell over Evelyn. She felt as though she had just witnessed the delivery of a death warrant, sealed not in wax, but in jelly. Her fears were realized with a speed that stole her breath. The sickness this case had took Alice Thatcher was not the gentle, soul-stealing apathy that had afflicted the others. This was a ravenous, violent decay. It began the day after she ate the conserve. She complained of a strange, cold fire in her stomach. Then came the weakness, a profound exhaustion that left her unable to rise from her bed. The village doctor was summoned. He found she had a raging fever, yet her skin was cold and clammy to the touch. He was, once again, completely baffled. John Thatcher, humbled and terrified, sat by his wife's bedside, his broken leg a dull ache compared to the sharp agony in his heart. He watched as the life seemed to drain out of her, her skin taking on a pale greenish pallor, her breath growing shallow and ragged. She became delirious, muttering about a cold green light and a hunger that was eating her from the inside out. The little boy, Thomas, who had also been given a small taste of the conserve by his mother, grew quiet and withdrawn. The rosy vitality of his cheeks vanished, replaced by a pale, waxy sheen. He didn't have the fever that was consuming his mother, but he seemed to be fading, shrinking in on himself. On the third day, as a storm broke over the valley and rain lashed against the cottage windows, Alice Thatcher died. Her passing sent a shockwave through Oakhaven. Death was a part of life in the valley, but this was different. It had been too fast, too strange, and it had come on the heels of the widow's gift. For the first time, a dark and terrible question mark hung over the name of Elara Blackwood. The whispers started immediately. They were tentative at first, spoken in hushed tones behind cupped hands. "Did you hear? Alice Thatcher is gone. She was fine just last week." The widow brought her that green jelly. But the village's addiction to Elara's comfort was a powerful thing. Denial rose like a shield. "Nonsense," the parson's wife declared. "Alice was always frail. Her constitution was weak. It was a mercy the widow tried to help at all." "John Thatcher angered her," someone else murmured. "Spoke ill of her kindness. Maybe this is a judgment." The villagers rallied around Elara, their fear of losing their source of comfort greater than their fear of the truth. They needed to believe in her goodness, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. When Elara attended Alice's funeral, dressed in simple, elegant black, her face a perfect mask of sorrowful sympathy, the villagers rushed to her side, offering her their condolences, as if she were the one who had suffered the loss. She accepted their words with quiet grace, her grey eyes serene. She was untouchable, protected by a wall of willful ignorance she herself had built, brick by delicious brick. Evelyn watched the funeral from a distance, a cold, hard knot of fury and helplessness in her chest. She was the only one who knew the truth. This wasn't a judgment or a tragic illness. It was a murder, a quiet, culinary assassination. But what could she do? Her word against the entire village? They would call her a hysterical, lonely spinster, jealous of the beautiful, beloved widow. They would run her out of town. John Thatcher was a broken man. His booming voice was gone, replaced by a hollow rasp. Guilt gnawed at him. He had been proud and stubborn, refusing the widow's help for himself, but he had allowed his wife to take it. He had let the serpent into his garden. He sat in his silent cottage, the storm of his grief too vast for tears, staring at the empty bed where his wife had wasted away. The blacksmith, Mr. Croft, was the first to break ranks. He approached Evelyn in the churchyard after the funeral, his face grim. He was a broad, powerful man, his hands calloused from the forge, but his eyes held a haunted look. "My Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "She's not the same. The widow gave her those sweets, and the grief went away. But she took my daughter with it. All that's left is a quiet ghost." He looked over at the fresh mound of earth that marked Alice Thatcher's grave. "This is different. But it's the same hand at work. I know it." Evelyn felt a surge of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She was not alone. "She gets things from the Whisperwood," Evelyn whispered, her eyes darting around to make sure no one could overhear. "Ingredients. I saw her." Mr. Croft's eyes widened. "The Whisperwood. No one goes there. Cursed ground." "She does," Evelyn insisted. "There is something wrong with her, Mr. Croft. Something evil." Their alliance was forged right there, in the shadow of the church, a tiny pocket of resistance in a village under siege. They had no plan, no proof that would sway the others. They only had their shared, terrible suspicion. Elara, of course, paid a visit to the grieving widower. She arrived at the Thatcher cottage a week after the funeral, carrying a basket laden with food. A warm shepherd's pie, a loaf of dark bread, a flask of what she called a restorative tonic. "You must eat, John," she said, her voice dripping with compassion as she stepped into the desolate home. "You must keep up your strength, for the boy's sake." John Thatcher looked at her and at the food she offered. He saw the face of the woman who had brought the glowing green poison into his house. But he also saw a warm meal, something he hadn't had in a week. He saw his son, Thomas, looking pale and thin, staring at the basket with hungry eyes. His will to fight was gone, drowned in his grief. He accepted the basket, his spirit utterly defeated. This became Ilara's new pattern. She was slowly, methodically consuming the Thatcher family. She had taken the wife. Now she was feeding the husband and son, binding them to her with their own hunger and sorrow. Evelyn and Mr. Croft could only watch from afar, powerless to intervene. The boy, Thomas, was the one who worried Evelyn the most. He was not recovering. He was a ghost in his own home, listless and pale. He barely spoke. He would sit for hours by the window, staring out at the woods with wide, vacant eyes. He was fading away, but not in the same way his mother had. It was a slower process, a gradual dimming of his life force. One night, weeks after the funeral, Evelyn was grading papers by lamplight, her mind a turmoil of fear and frustration. The schoolhouse was quiet, the only sound the scratching of her pen and the sighing of the wind outside. A sudden impulse made her walk to the window that overlooked the valley. Her eyes were drawn to the Thatcher cottage, a lone dark shape on the hillside. As she watched, a light appeared in the window of the boy's bedroom. It was not the warm, flickering yellow of a candle. It was a faint, sickly, phosphorescent green. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The light was identical to the one she had seen pouring from Ilara's box in the heart of the Whisperwood. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic, living beat, like a diseased heart. It was coming from inside the room. It was coming from the boy himself. The terrible truth crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. The ingredient hadn't just killed Alice. In Thomas, it had taken root. He wasn't just sick. He was contaminated. He was incubating the horror he had swallowed. The widow's recipe did not always kill. Sometimes it was far more patient. Sometimes it planted a garden of its own. But what terrible, unnatural fruit would ripen in the violated soil of a child's heart? We think of life as a flame, a warm, flickering, hungry thing. And we think of death as its extinguishing, a descent into cold, simple darkness. But the universe holds corners where the rules are different. What if there is a third state? Not a flame, but a phosphorescence. A cold light that feeds on the warmth of its host, a mimicry of life that ripens in the flesh and heralds only decay. This was the light in Thomas Thatcher's window. It was not life. It was an infestation of the soul. Evelyn saw it night after night, a sickly, pulsing beacon in the oppressive dark of the valley. It was a secret she could not bear alone. The next day, she sought out Mr. Croft at his forge, the clang of his hammer on the anvil a solid, reassuring sound in a world that had lost its moorings. She told him what she had seen, her voice a low, trembling whisper against the roar of the fire. He looked at her, his face a mask of weary disbelief. A light? Evelyn, the boy is sick. Grief does strange things to the mind, to your eyes. This was not a trick of the light, she insisted, her intensity cutting through his doubt. It was the same light from the box she dug up in the Whisperwood. I know it. You must see it for yourself. Watch the cottage tonight. If I am wrong, then you can call me a madwoman, and we will speak of it no more. Doubt and a grim curiosity warred in the blacksmith's eyes. He had seen what the widow's kindness had done to his daughter. He had seen it kill Alice Thatcher. Perhaps a glowing boy was not so far beyond the pale. He gave a single, curt nod. Tonight, they met at the edge of the woods as twilight fell, two small figures in a world of growing shadows. They found a vantage point on a hill overlooking the Thatcher cottage, concealing themselves in a grove of skeletal birch trees. They waited in a tense, shared silence as the darkness deepened, and the lights in the village blinked out one by one. The Thatcher cottage was dark, a place of mourning. And then it began. It started as a faint, barely perceptible glimmer in the small upstairs window. Then it grew, strengthening into a definitive, unmistakable green glow. It pulsed with a slow, sick, biological rhythm, casting a pale, spectral light that seemed to warp the very air around it. Mr. Croft let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a sound halfway between a gasp and a curse. "Mother of God," he whispered, his voice rough with horror. "It's true." They were no longer just two suspicious neighbors. They were witnesses. They were the sole members of a congregation that had seen the devil's candlelight. And they were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The change in Thomas Thatcher accelerated. The light seemed to be feeding on him, consuming his substance. He grew thinner, his skin stretched taut over his small bones, taking on the same translucent quality as Silas Abernathy's. He no longer spoke, communicating only in a low, continuous hum, a single, monotonous note that vibrated deep in his chest. His father, John, lost in the fog of his own grief and sedated by the widow's gifts, seemed not to notice the full extent of the horror unfolding in his own home. To him, the boy was just sick with sorrow. He did not see the light. He did not hear the wrongness in the humming. The boy's habits changed too. He developed an aversion to sunlight, spending his days in the darkest corners of the cottage. He refused all food except for the small, specially prepared custards and jellies that Elara brought for him. Evelyn, watching from afar, saw the terrible symbiosis. The parasite within the boy would only accept sustenance from the hand that had planted it there. The whispers in the village, which had quieted after Alice's funeral, began to stir again, this time with a new and sharper edge. They were no longer about the widow's strangeness, but about the slow, visible decay of the Thatcher family. It was one thing to lose a frail mother. It was another to watch a father and son waste away in plain sight. Mr. Croft, now a man with a mission, became the collector of these whispers, the unwilling archivist of Oakhaven's growing dread. He would nurse a single ale in the tavern and listen. He heard the stable-master recount how his strongest horse, a creature that had never shied from anything, had reared up in terror and nearly bolted when Elara walked past, carrying a covered dish. The dish, he swore, had smelled faintly of river mud and decay. He spoke to Martha Gable, the old gossip, whose cat had first recoiled from Elara's pie. She confessed that her pig, the one she'd fed the pie to, had given birth to a litter of stillborn, misshapen things a month later, before dying itself. She had told no one, fearing they'd call her a fool, or worse, that the widow's displeasure would fall upon her next. These were the testimonies, not sworn statements, but fearful confessions whispered in the dark, a jar of preserves that, when opened, was found to be crawling with a pale, thread-like mould that seemed to move on its own, a restorative broth that had cured a man's cough, but had also stolen his ability to dream. Each story was a single, twisted thread. Mr. Croft and Evelyn were the only ones trying to weave them together, and the tapestry they were creating was one of methodical, malicious intent. Their investigation gave them a new focus. Elara's cooking itself. They needed to understand her methods, her rituals. An opportunity arose from the unlikeliest of sources. John Thatcher. One night Mr. Croft found the woodcutter in the tavern, drunk and weeping into his ale. His usual stoicism was dissolved, leaving behind only raw, ragged grief. "She tells me things," John slurred, his voice thick with misery and cheap spirits. He was talking about Lara. "Strange things about the food she brings for Tommy." Mr. Croft leaned in, his expression carefully neutral. "What kind of things, John?" "The little custard," he mumbled, staring into his cup. "She says it must only be served in a silver spoon, never wood, never pewter. Says the wood would sour it." He let out a choked, bitter laugh. "And the jelly for his throat. It must never see the light of day. I am to keep it in a locked box in the cellar and only bring it up after the sun is fully set. She said the sunlight would—" bruise it, spoil the flavor. Mr. Croft felt a chill snake down his spine. These were not the instructions of a cook. They were the commandments of a sorceress. Silver, a metal of purity. Sunlight, a force of life. Her ingredients, her recipes, were creatures of darkness, things that could not abide the touch of the mundane or the holy. He pressed on. Did she say anything else, John? About where she gets these things? John Thatcher shook his head, his brief moment of clarity sinking back into a drunken fog. From her garden, from the woods. Says she uses old family recipes. He began to sob again. A broken man mourning a life he didn't understand. He was still in the process of losing. Mr. Croft left the tavern with a new sense of urgency. Elara was not just a murderer. She was a practitioner of some dark, ancient art. Her kitchen was her temple, her recipes, her scripture. As if sensing their growing knowledge, Elara began to close the net around them. She encountered Evelyn outside the general store a few days later. Her smile was as serene as ever, but her grey eyes were like chips of ice. "Miss Reed," she said, her voice a soft, silken threat. "You seem troubled. There are dark circles under your eyes. I've noticed you don't sleep well." Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. "I'm fine. Thank you." Elara took a step closer, her presence suddenly overwhelming. "Are you? Fear can be an illness all its own. It festers in the dark. It feeds on the imagination until it consumes the truth." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I have a wonderful recipe for a Taisan. Special herbs. It brings a deep and dreamless sleep. It quiets a restless mind. Perhaps you would allow me to bring you some this evening." It was not an offer. It was a threat. A promise of the same silencing peace that had been given to Silas Abernathy and Clara Croft. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She saw her own future in that moment. A quiet, placid shell sitting in the schoolhouse, the fire of her mind extinguished forever. "No," Evelyn managed to say, her voice thin but firm. "No, thank you. I am perfectly well." Elara's smile tightened by a fraction. "As you wish," she murmured, before gliding away, leaving Evelyn trembling in the street. The threat galvanized them. Hiding and watching was no longer enough. They needed answers. Evelyn, driven by a desperate need for context, turned to the only history Oakhaven possessed, the dusty church records kept in the damp cellar of the parsonage. She spent hours poring over brittle, leather-bound volumes, her fingers stained with a century of dust. She read through decades of births, deaths, and marriages, a monotonous litany of forgotten lives. And then she found it. It was in the parish log of 1788, the script of a long-dead parson, spidery and faded. He wrote of a terrible winter, of a wasting sickness that had fallen upon the village. His descriptions were chillingly familiar. The afflicted grew pale and weak, taking on a ghostly pallor. They lost their wits, becoming quiet and docile. And most terrifyingly, he wrote of a St. Elmo's fire of the flesh, a cold swamp light that could be seen glowing in the chests of the sickest as they lay dying in the dark. The parson wrote that the plague had started after the arrival of a mysterious woman, an outsider who had taken up residence in the woods. A woman renowned for her knowledge of herbs and her miraculous cures, which she shared freely. As the village sickened and died, the parson's entries grew more frantic. He called her a disciple of Belial, a blight in human form. The final entry was a single scrawled sentence, the ink blotched as if his hand were shaking violently. "She is not one of us. She feeds the flock to her shepherd. The woods have taken them. May God have mercy on Oakhaven." After that entry, the record stopped for nearly a year. When they resumed, it was with a different parson, and the population of the village had been reduced by half. Evelyn stared at the page, her blood like ice water in her veins. This had happened before. Elara was not new. She was a recurrence, a plague that returned to Oakhaven generation after generation. The house, the woods, the recipes. They were all part of a cycle, a terrible, repeating history. She and Mr. Croft knew they were running out of time. Thomas Thatcher was getting worse. The humming had stopped, replaced by a complete, unnerving silence. He had begun to wander at night, a small, glowing spectre drifting through the lanes of the sleeping village, drawn by some unheard call. They had to know what Elara was. They had to know what was in that box. They had to see inside her kitchen. They chose the night of the next new moon, the same night Evelyn had followed Elara into the woods. They knew she would be out, performing her dark foraging. It was their only chance to approach the cottage unseen. They crept through the oppressive darkness, their hearts pounding in unison, two flickering candles of defiance against a tidal wave of evil. The Blackwood cottage was dark as they expected. A single thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the faint, cloying scent of strange, bitter herbs. They circled the small house, looking for a way to see inside. They found it in the back. A small kitchen window, one of the shutters left slightly ajar, offering a narrow vertical slice of the room within. Mr. Croft gave Evelyn a boost, and she peered through the crack. What she saw made the breath catch in her throat. This was no cosy country kitchen. It was an alchemist's laboratory, an apothecary of nightmares. Bundles of dark, twisted herbs hung from the rafters, arranged in geometric patterns that hurt the eyes. Strange glass jars lined the shelves, containing things suspended in murky fluid, pale, coiled things, and what looked like small, skeletal hands. The air, even through the crack, was thick with the smell of damp earth, bitter incense, and something else, a coppery, metallic scent, like old blood. Elara was not gone. She was there. She stood with her back to them at a large scrubbed pine table in the center of the room. A single candle burned on the table, its flame unnaturally steady, casting a pool of greasy yellow light. She was not cooking. She was utterly still. Her attention focused on something on the table before her. Slowly, she turned, as if to inspect an ingredient on a shelf, and they saw what she was working with. On the table lay a large, ancient-looking book, its pages a sickly yellow, and covered in a script that was not of any human language. Next to the book lay the source of Thomas Thatcher's affliction. It was a gnarled, blackened root, roughly the size of a newborn child, and it had the unmistakable, grotesque shape of a desiccated humanoid figure. This was the thing from the buried box. A faint green luminescence pulsed from within its twisted form. Evelyn clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. As she watched, paralyzed with horror, Elara picked up a small, wickedly sharp silver knife. She leaned over the terrible man-shaped root, and with the steady, meticulous hand of a surgeon, she began to scrape a fine, glowing powder from its skin onto a waiting porcelain dish. And as the silver blade touched it, the root, the ingredient, seemed to writhe. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch, a spasm of ancient, unholy life. They had come seeking the secrets of a kitchen, the hidden ingredients of a recipe. They found instead the scripture of a dark faith and the desecration of a sacred form. They learned that the devil's oldest recipes are not written in the blood of his enemies, but are served with a loving smile to his chosen flock. There are some truths the mind refuses to hold, an image so blasphemous it seeks to erase itself, a sight so fundamentally wrong it fractures the very foundation of reason. A root shaped like a child, a knife scraping light from desiccated flesh, a kitchen that is also a tomb. When you have seen the unseeable, where does the truth go? It does not vanish. It burrows inside you, a parasitic horror, a seed of madness waiting for the right moment to sprout. Evelyn and Mr. Croft stumbled away from the widow's cottage, their flight as silent and desperate as their approach. They did not speak until they reached the cold, solid safety of the forge. The blacksmith collapsed onto a stool, his powerful frame trembling, his face the color of ash. Evelyn stood ramrod straight, her terror a rigid shell holding her together. "That thing," Mr. Croft finally rasped, his voice raw. "It looked like a mandrake from those old terrible stories." "It was worse than a story," Evelyn said, her own voice hollow, distant. She was paring it, like it was a turnip. The ingredient for Thomas Thatcher's custard, the ingredient that killed Alice. The word hung in the air between them. Ingredient. It was too small, too mundane for the obscenity they had witnessed. What they had seen was not cooking. It was a ritual of defilement. The book, the silver knife, the humanoid root. It was a trinity of profound, ancient evil. They had peered behind the curtain and discovered that their world was a lie, a thin, fragile veneer over a pit of unimaginable darkness. For 2 days, they were paralyzed by the enormity of their discovery. Their fear was a physical presence, a cold, heavy blanket that smothered thought and action. What could they possibly do? To confront Ilara was suicide. To tell the villagers would be to be branded as insane. They were 2 people against a power that had held this valley in its thrall for centuries. They were trapped, and the walls were closing in. It was Evelyn who finally broke the spell of their despair. "We cannot be the only ones," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its usual determined edge. "There has to be some authority, some goodness left that can stand against this. The church, the reverend." Mr. Croft looked at her, his eyes full of doubt. "Reverend Michael? He eats her bread every Sunday. He praises her charity from the pulpit." "He is a man of God," Evelyn insisted, though a part of her was trying to convince herself as much as him. "His faith is supposed to be a shield against this kind of darkness. He deals in souls and salvation. He must be made to see the truth. He is our only hope." Reluctantly, the blacksmith agreed. They were drowning, and the parsonage was the only piece of driftwood in sight. They went the next morning, requesting a private meeting with Reverend Michael. They found him in his study, a room that smelled of old paper, beeswax, and comforting certainty. He welcomed them with a gentle pate, Reynolds' smile, gesturing for them to sit, and so they told him. They poured out the entire sawdery tale, their words tumbling over one another in their urgency. They spoke of Silas Abernathy's stolen memory, of Clara Croft's hollowed-out soul, of the Thatcher family's destruction. They told him about the lie, the newspaper clipping that proved Ilara a fraud. They described the secret trips to the Whisperwood, the buried box, the unholy green light. Finally, their voices dropping to a near whisper, they recounted the scene they had witnessed through the kitchen window, the grimoire, the silver knife, and the terrible, squirming, man-shaped root. Throughout their frantic testimony, Reverend Michael sat perfectly still, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his expression one of calm, patient listening. He did not interrupt. He did not recoil in horror. When they had finished, an unnerving silence filled the study. The Reverend finally lowered his hands and gave them a sad, pitying smile. "My dear children," he began, his voice a balm of condescending tranquility, "you have been through a great deal of trauma." Evelyn stared at him, bewildered. "Trauma? Reverend, did you hear what we said? This woman is a monster. She is killing your parishioners." "She is a healer," he corrected gently. "A kind, charitable soul who has brought comfort to this valley." "Mr. Croft," he said, turning his placid gaze to the blacksmith, "you have suffered a great loss in the change that has come over your daughter. Grief can curdle the mind. It can make a man see demons where there are only shadows." He then turned to Evelyn. "And Miss Reed, You are a lonely woman, far from home, in a town you find rustic. It is not uncommon for a mind such as yours, an educated mind, to create elaborate fantasies to explain the simple hardships of life. Hysteria, they used to call it. A wandering womb. Evelyn felt a surge of cold fury. This is not hysteria. This is not grief-addled fantasy. We saw what we saw. Did you? The Reverend asked, his voice still infuriatingly calm. Or did you see what your fear wanted you to see? A strange root from the forest? Many of them have odd shapes. A book? The woman is learned in herbology. A light? Swamp gas has been known to glow. For every one of your spectres, there is a rational earthly explanation. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, it was like a physical blow. He wasn't just dismissing them. He was pathologizing them, turning their righteous fear into a symptom of their own brokenness. "And the Thatcher boy," Mr. Croft growled, his hands clenching into fists. "Is there a rational explanation for a child glowing in the dark?" The Reverend's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I have heard the rumors. A sick child, a trick of the moonlight on a window pane. My friends, you are building a cathedral of madness out of whispers and twigs." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Widow Blackwood is a great benefactor to this parish. Her generosity has allowed us to repair the roof, to buy new hymnals. She is a pillar of this community. These malicious stories you are spreading must stop, for the good of the village, for your own good." He stood up, the meeting clearly over. "Go home. Pray to God to deliver you from these delusions, and speak no more of this. It is a poison you are spreading, and it will find no purchase here." They left the parsonage, stumbling back out into the weak sunlight, the door closing behind them with a dreadful finality. They had not just been dismissed. They had been threatened. The one institution that should have been their sanctuary was complicit. The shepherd was protecting the wolf because the wolf kept the chapel roof from leaking. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. There are some truths the mind refuses to hold. An image so blasphemous it seeks to erase itself. A sight so fundamentally wrong it fractures the very foundation of reason. A root shaped like a child. A knife scraping light from desiccated flesh. A kitchen that is also a tomb. When you have seen the unseeable, where does the truth go? It does not vanish. It burrows inside you, a parasitic horror, a seed of madness waiting for the right moment to sprout. Evelyn and Mr. Croft stumbled away from the widow's cottage, their flight as silent and desperate as their approach. They did not speak until they reached the cold, solid safety of the forge. The blacksmith collapsed onto a stool, his powerful frame trembling, his face the color of ash. Evelyn stood ramrod straight, her terror a rigid shell holding her together. "That thing," Mr. Croft finally rasped, his voice raw. "It looked like a mandrake from those old, terrible stories." "It was worse than a story," Evelyn said, her own voice hollow, distant. She was paring it, like it was a turnip. The ingredient for Thomas Thatcher's custard. The ingredient that killed Alice. The word hung in the air between them. Ingredient. It was too small, too mundane for the obscenity they had witnessed. What they had seen was not cooking. It was a ritual of defilement. The book, the silver knife, the humanoid root. It was a trinity of profound, ancient evil. They had peered behind the curtain and discovered that their world was a lie, a thin, fragile veneer over a pit of unimaginable darkness. For 2 days, they were paralyzed by the enormity of their discovery. Their fear was a physical presence, a cold, heavy blanket that smothered thought and action. What could they possibly do? To confront Ilara was suicide. To tell the villagers would be to be branded as insane. They were 2 people against a power that had held this veto. alley in its thrall for centuries. They were trapped, and the walls were closing in. It was Evelyn who finally broke the spell of their despair. "We cannot be the only ones," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its usual determined edge. "There has to be some authority, some goodness left that can stand against this. The church. The Reverend." Mr. Croft looked at her, his eyes full of doubt. "Reverend Michael. He eats her bread every Sunday. He praises her charity from the pulpit. He is a man of God," Evelyn insisted, though a part of her was trying to convince herself as much as him. "His faith is supposed to be a shield against this kind of darkness. He deals in souls and salvation. He must be made to see the truth. He is our only hope." Reluctantly, the blacksmith agreed. They were drowning, and the parsonage was the only piece of driftwood in sight. They went the next morning, requesting a private meeting with Reverend Michael. They found him in his study, a room that smelled of old paper, beeswax, and comforting certainty. He welcomed them with a gentle paternal smile, gesturing for them to sit. And so they told him. They poured out the entire sawdery tale, their words tumbling over one another in their urgency. They spoke of Silas Abernathy's stolen memory, of Clara Croft's hollowed-out soul, of the Thatcher family's destruction. They told him about the lie, the newspaper clipping that proved Ilara a fraud. They described the secret trips to the Whisperwood, the buried box, the unholy green light. Finally, their voices dropping to a near whisper, they recounted the scene they had witnessed through the kitchen window, the grimoire, the silver knife, and the terrible, squirming, man-shaped root. Throughout their frantic testimony, Reverend Michael sat perfectly still, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his expression one of calm, patient Listini. He did not interrupt. He did not recoil in horror. When they had finished, an unnerving silence filled the study. The Reverend finally lowered his hands and gave them a sad, pitying smile. "My dear children," he began, his voice a balm of condescending tranquility, "you have been through a great deal of trauma." Evelyn stared at him, bewildered. "Trauma? Reverend, did you hear what we said? This woman is a monster. She is killing your parishioners." "She is a healer," he corrected gently, "a kind, charitable soul who has brought comfort to this valley." "Mr. Croft," he said, turning his placid gaze to the blacksmith, "you have suffered a great loss in the change that has come over your daughter. Grief can curdle the mind. It can make a man see demons where there are only shadows." He then turned to Evelyn. "And Miss Reed, you are a lonely woman, far from home, in a town you find rustic. It is not uncommon for a mind such as yours, an educated mind, to create elaborate fantasies to explain the simple hardships of life. Hysteria, they used to call it. A wandering womb." Evelyn felt a surge of cold fury. "This is not hysteria. This is not grief-addled fantasy. We saw what we saw." "Did you?" the Reverend asked, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "Or did you see what your fear wanted you to see? A strange root from the forest? Many of them have odd shapes. A book? The woman is learned in herbology. A light? Swamp gas has been known to glow. For every one of your spectres, there is a rational, earthly explanation." The betrayal was so absolute, so complete. It was like a physical blow. He wasn't just dismissing them, he was pathologizing them, turning their righteous fear into a symptom of their own brokenness. "And the Thatcher boy?" Mr. Croft growled, his hands clenching into fists. "Is there a rational explanation for a child glowing in the dark?" The Reverend's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I have heard the rumors. A sick child, a trick of the moonlight on a window pane. My friends, you are building a cathedral of madness out of whispers and twigs." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Widow Blackwood, is a great benefactor to this parish. Her generosity has allowed us to repair the roof, to buy new hymnals. She is a pillar of this community. These malicious stories you are spreading must stop, for the good of the village, for your own good." He stood up, the meeting clearly over. "Go home. Pray to God to deliver you from these delusions, and speak no more of this. It is a poison you are spreading, and it will find no purchase here." They left the parsonage, stumbling back out into the weak sunlight, the door closing behind them with a dreadful finality. They had not just been dismissed, they had been threatened. The one institution that should have been their sanctuary was complicit. The shepherd was protecting the wolf, because the wolf kept the chapel roof from leaking. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The world had shrunk. Their fear, once a focused beam on Ilara's cottage, now radiated outwards, encompassing the entire village. Who else knew? Who else had been bought with a new roof or a jar of jam? Who amongst the smiling faces in the market square was watching them, reporting back to the witch in the woods? Oakhaven was no longer their home. It was a prison, and every other inmate was a collaborator. Their betrayal did not remain a secret for long. Reverend Michael, in his sanctimonious wisdom, must have gone straight to the widow, because the very next day the counterattack began. It was subtle at first, a shift in the social weather. When Evelyn entered the general store, the conversation would halt, replaced by a strained silence. When Mr. Croft went to the tavern, men he had known his whole life would suddenly find their mugs fascinating, refusing to meet his eye. The whist purse had started again, but this time they were about the schoolteacher and the blacksmith. The rumours were insidious, tailored to their vulnerabilities. Evelyn Reed, they said, was having a nervous breakdown. Her lessons had become dark and morbid. She was scaring the children with stories of demons and witches. One child claimed the teacher had stared out the window for a full hour, muttering about green lights that no one else could see. The stories about Mr. Croft were just as cruel. He was drinking, they whispered. His grief had finally broken him. He was neglecting the forge, his work growing shoddy and unreliable. He'd been seen sneaking around at night, peering into people's windows like a common peeping Tom. Ilara was turning the village against them, using the very people they were trying to save as her weapon. It was a masterful, devastating stroke of psychological warfare. She was isolating them, discrediting them, painting them as the source of the town's unease. Then came the gifts. They were no longer offerings of food, but acts of pure intimidation. One morning, Mr. Croft arrived at his forge to find a single object lying dead center on his anvil. It was a knife, a small, elegant paring knife with a silver blade of exquisite lethal sharpness. It was a perfect piece of craftsmanship, far beyond anything he could make himself. It was identical to the one they had seen in Ilara's hand. There was no note. None was needed. It was a message. I know you were there. I know what you saw. Ilara's message to Evelyn was even more personal. Pinned to the heavy oak door of the schoolhouse was a single pressed flower. It was a beautiful night-black bloom with a deep, velvety texture, a species of orchid Evelyn had never seen before. She knew with a sickening certainty that it did not grow in any common garden. It was a creature of deep, perpetual shade. It was a flower that could only have been picked in the heart of the Whisperwood. I can get to Yai. How anywhere, it said. Your locked doors mean nothing to me. The fear they now lived with was constant and suffocating. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching eye. Every villager's smile seemed to hide a knowing smirk. They were outcasts, the town lunatics, and the monster they were trying to fight was being celebrated as a saint. Their only concern now was for the boy. Thomas Thatcher was the living proof of Ilara's evil, a child being used as a ghastly incubator. But his father, John, was lost to them. Consumed by his grief, sedated by Ilara's food, and now poisoned by the village gossip, he had come to see Evelyn and Mr. Croft not as potential saviours, but as troublemakers who were upsetting the fragile peace of his morning. He had been seen visiting the parsonage and then the Blackwood cottage, his face a mask of grim determination. The breaking point came on a cold, windswept night. A storm was brewing, the sky a bruised purple, the wind howling like a hungry animal. Mr. Croft, unable to rest, was watching the Thatcher cottage from his smithy. He saw a lantern bobbing down the hill from the widow's cottage. It was Ilara, paying a late-night visit. An hour later, she left. But a few minutes after that, the door to the Thatcher cottage burst open. It was John Thatcher. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, a figure of pure, untamed rage. He held something in his hand, an axe. He began to storm down the lane, his gait unsteady but terrifyingly purposeful, heading directly for the schoolhouse. Mr. Croft didn't hesitate. He ran, his great lungs burning, taking the back alleys, his heart hammering with a terror that was sharp and immediate. This was it. The final stroke. He burst through the schoolhouse door without knocking, finding Evelyn grading papers by the weak light of a single lamp. She looked up, startled. "It's John Thatcher," the blacksmith panted, his chest heaving. "He's coming for you. He's got his axe." Evelyn's face went white. She scrambled to the window, peering out into the stormy darkness. "The widow!" Croft gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "She was just there. She must have told him something." And as Evelyn watched, a shape emerged from the swirling gloom, staggering down the lane toward them. It was the woodcutter, his face a mask of insane, grief-stricken fury, his eyes burning with a righteous madness. The moonlight glinted off the honed edge of the woodcutting axe in his hand. He was not just a grieving father. He was an executioner, sent to dispense the widow's justice. Ilara's most potent recipe, her most immediate and deadly creation, required no cooking at all. She had simply taken a good man's sorrow, seasoned it with whispered lies, fermented it in the dark vessel of his grief, and served it back to him boiling with a murderous rage. The betrayal was complete. It was not the compromised priest or the frightened villagers. The betrayer was the flock itself, turned into a weapon in the shepherdess's hand. The most terrifying monsters are not the ones who crawl from the abyss, wreathed in shadow and stinking of sulphur. They are the ones who live next door, the ones whose grief you have witnessed, whose calloused hands you have shaken in the market square. For there is no horror more profound, no madness more absolute, than watching a good man you know become a weapon in another's hand. The first blow against the schoolhouse door was a sound of pure violation. It was not a knock, but a wet, splintering crack as the axe bit deep into the old oak. It was the sound of a world ending. John Thatcher's roar followed, a ragged, inhuman cry of pure, distilled rage. "Witch! Come out! Leave my boy be!" Evelyn and Mr. Croft stumbled back from the door as if the wood itself were white-hot. The second blow landed, heavier than the first, and a jagged crack appeared, showing a sliver of the stormy, furious night outside. "He's gone! Mad!" Evelyn breathed, her voice a knot of terror. "She's poured poison in his ear," Mr. Croft countered, his face a grim mask of determination. He shoved a heavy teacher's desk against the door, the wood groaning in protest. "It's her words coming out of his mouth." "Sorceress! I know what you are," Thatcher screamed, his voice thick with the lies Ilara had fed him. "You're the curse. Your jealousy is a sickness on this town. She told me. The good widow told me." Another blow and another. The wood was beginning to splinter and give way around the lock. The desk shuddered with each impact. They were in a trap, a flimsy wooden box about to be cracked open by a man who was no longer a man, but an instrument of the widow's will. "The back window," Mr. Croft grunted, heaving a cast-iron stove to buttress the desk. "It's our only chance." They scrambled to the rear of the single-room schoolhouse. The window was old, the sash swollen with a century of damp Oakhaven winters. It was painted shut. As John Thatcher's axe began to systematically destroy the door, panel by splintering panel, Mr. Croft put his shoulder to the window frame. He pushed, his muscles straining, the veins standing out on his neck. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the old paint seal broke and the window flew open, letting in a blast of cold, rain-soaked wind. "Go," he urged Evelyn. "I'll be right behind you." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She clambered through the opening, her dress catching on a nail, tearing with a sharp rip. She fell into the muddy yard behind the schoolhouse, the shock of the cold ground momentarily stunning her. Behind her, she heard the schoolhouse door finally give way with a deafening crash, followed by a roar of triumph from Thatcher. Mr. Croft was a large man, and the window was a tight fit. He was halfway through when Thatcher, his eyes wild and lunatic in the dim light, saw their escape. He charged through the ruined doorway, swinging the axe. Croft threw himself the rest of the way through the window, landing heavily beside Evelyn, just as the axe head embedded itself deep in the window frame where his body had been a second before. They didn't look back. They scrambled to their feet and ran. They fled the small, fragile circle of light and order that was the schoolhouse and plunged into the welcoming, terrifying darkness of the woods. Rain lashed down, instantly soaking them to the bone, the wind tearing at their clothes and roaring in their ears. Behind them, they could hear John Thatcher's enraged shouts, but he did not follow. He stood in the wreckage of the schoolhouse, a baffled, thwarted beast. As they ran, stumbling through the grasping undergrowth, Evelyn glanced back towards the village. Lights were on now. Windows glowed with a warm yellow light. She could see figures, silhouettes behind the safety of their glass panes. They were watching. The whole village was watching the assault on the schoolhouse. And not a single door opened. Not a single voice cried out to stop him. Not a single soul came to their aid. They were complicit, every one of them, silent spectators at an execution they had tacitly approved. The feeling of betrayal was a colder, sharper pain than the winter rain. They ran until their lungs burned, and their legs were numb, pushing deeper and deeper into Ilara's domain. The woods, once a place of quiet, atmospheric dread, were now their only sanctuary. The storm was a blessing, its fury covering their tracks and masking the sound of their flight. They were fugitives, hunted not by a monster, but by the very community they had sought to protect. They finally found Helter in a place Mr. Croft knew from his youth, a small, dry cave hidden behind a curtain of ivy, tucked into the side of a mossy ravine. They collapsed inside, shivering and gasping for breath, the sounds of the storm a muted roar outside. For a long time they said nothing, the reality of their situation settling upon them. They had lost everything, their homes, their reputations, their safety. They were exiles in their own land. It was the blacksmith who finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "No more," he said. "No more hiding. No more watching." Evelyn looked at him. In the gloom of the cave, she could see a change in his face. The fear was still there, but it had been burned down. Forged by the night's events into something hard and sharp, it had become resolve. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice weary. "The village is against us. Thatcher is looking for us. We have nothing." "We have the truth," he countered, slapping his hand against the cold stone of the cave wall. "And we have this, the fear. Let's use it." He looked at her, his eyes catching a faint glimmer of light from the cave mouth. "You were right before, Evelyn. We can't reason with them. We can't prove anything. We've been trying to fight a sickness with words. It's time we fought it with a knife." "You don't mean—" "No," he said quickly. "Not her. Not yet. I mean the source of her power. The root. The book. You and I, we've been the prey. It's time we became the hunters." A spark ignited in Evelyn's chest, a flicker of defiance in the cold emptiness of her despair. He was right. Their passive observation was over. The rules had changed the moment that Axe struck the door. They were no longer victims. They were at war. A desperate, hopeless war, perhaps, but a war nonetheless. "How?" she asked. "Her cottage is a fortress. She'll be there waiting for us." "She has to sleep," he reasoned. "She has to leave the cottage to visit the Thatchers or the parsonage. We just have to be patient. We watch her, we learn her routine, and when she is gone, we break in. We find the book. We find that thing she keeps in the cellar, or wherever it is, and we destroy it. We burn it all." It was a suicidal plan, a fool's errand, but it was also the only plan they had. To flee the valley was to surrender, to leave Thomas Thatcher and the rest of the villagers to their fate. To stay and do nothing was to wait for John Thatcher's axe or Ilara's poisoned spoon to find them. Their only path forward was through the heart of the monster's lair. They spent the rest of the night in the cold, damp cave, the storm slowly blowing itself out. They spoke in low tones, refining their desperate strategy. They would use Mr. Croft's knowledge of the woods to stay hidden and Evelyn's keen eye for observation to watch the cottage. They would become ghosts, shadows haunting the edges of the village that had cast them out. As the first, weak light of dawn filtered through the trees, painting the world in shades of grey and bruised purple, the storm finally passed. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the dripping of water from the leaves. Mr. Croft crept to the mouth of the cave and peered out, his body tense. "What is it?" Evelyn whispered. "They're looking for us," he said, his voice grim. He motioned for her to look. Evelyn crawled to his side. From their vantage point, they could see the edge of the village. A group of men was assembling in the market square. At the head of the group stood Reverend Michael, his face set in a look of pious gravity. And beside him, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes still burning with a cold fire, was John Thatcher. Other villagers were there too, farmers and tradesmen, their faces a mixture of fear, excitement and grim duty. Some of them carried lanterns, a few carried old hunting rifles. It was not a search party. It was a posse. "She's branded us as witches," Evelyn said, the realization dawning with cold horror. "Thatcher's attack was just the beginning. Now she's using the whole village to hunt us down." Their plan was in ruins. Ilara would never leave her cottage now, not while her bloodhounds were out searching for her enemies. They were trapped in the woods, with a manhunt behind them and the witch's lair ahead. They were caught between the hammer and the anvil. As they watched the posse begin to spread out, preparing to enter the woods, a sound from behind them in the ravine made them both freeze. It was a soft, shuffling sound in the damp leaves. It was followed by a low, tuneless hum. Evelyn and Mr. Croft turned slowly, their hearts seizing in their chests. There, standing not 20 feet away, partially shrouded in the morning mist that coiled up from the ravine floor, was a small, solitary figure. It was Thomas Thatcher. He was pale as bone, his clothes damp and smeared with mud. His eyes were wide and utterly vacant, staring into a distance they could not see. The front of his small shirt was unbuttoned, and from the hollow of his throat a faint, sickly green light pulsed in the dim morning, a grotesque and living jewel. He was humming his strange, monotonous tune, seemingly oblivious to their presence. He had wandered out of his bed, out of his house, and deep into the woods, a small, luminous ghost drawn by some silent command. He had found them, or perhaps he had been sent to find them. They had fled the weaponized father, the man wielding an axe and shouting his rage, and now they had been found by the contaminated son, a silent walking vessel of the plague itself. In this desperate war of whispers and witchcraft, who was the Moors? A dangerous messenger, the one sent to destroy your body, or the one sent to announce the damnation of your soul? There is a silence worse than any scream. It is the silence of a vessel, a body that still walks and breathes, but whose true occupant has long since departed, leaving only the faint, mindless hum of the machinery behind. When Evelyn and Mr. Croft looked at the boy in the mist, they were not looking at Thomas Thatcher. They were looking at a lantern of flesh, meticulously hollowed out and filled with a strange, cold light. And the light inside was not his own. He stood before them, a small, tragic apparition, the eerie green glow at his throat pulsing in the gloom. The posse was behind them, a chorus of angry, fearful men. The witch's cottage was ahead, a silent, waiting trap. And here, in the middle, was the living evidence of the crime, the walking, breathing proof of their sanity. The boy was not a threat. He was the entire war, encapsulated in one small, wasting body. Evelyn took a half-step forward. "Thomas?" she whispered, the name a fragile, hopeful thing in the dead air of the ravine. The boy did not respond. His vacant eyes did not seem to see them. The humming in his chest was the only sound he made, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to make the very air around him vibrate. He turned, his movements slow and disconnected, like a sleepwalker, and began to walk, not back towards the village, not towards the cottage, but deeper into the woods, into the ancient tangled heart of the Whisperwood. After a few paces, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. His expression was utterly blank, an empty slate. It was not an invitation, not a plea. It was simply a fact. He was going this way. They could follow, or they could stay and be torn apart by the righteous, misguided fury of their neighbors. "What do we do?" Mr. Croft breathed, his hand instinctively going to the small hatchet tucked in his belt. "We can't let him go alone," Evelyn said, her teacher's instinct overriding her fear. "And we can't stay here." It was the choice between a definite known danger and a terrifying unknown one. They chose the unknown. They began to follow the glowing boy, two fugitives led by a child-shaped will-o'-the-wisp, plunging deeper into the forest that had become their prison. The posse's shouts grew fainter behind them, muffled by the thick, ancient trees. The boy moved with a strange, unerring purpose, his small feet never stumbling on the gnarled roots, his body slipping through the grasping thorns as if they weren't there. He was not walking through the woods, so much as the woods were parting for him. The green light at his throat seemed to act as a key, the ancient forest recognizing one of its own. He led them on a winding, circuitous path for what felt like hours, until they arrived at a place they recognized with a jolt of primal fear. It was the clearing, the small, unnatural circle of dead earth where the monolithic black-barked oak tree stood like a sentinel to some forgotten hell. This was where Ilara had dug up her buried box. Evelyn and Mr. Croft stopped at the edge of the clearing, but the boy did not. He walked directly to the base of the ancient tree, the place where the earth had been disturbed. He stopped, his humming growing slightly louder, the light in his throat brightening. He raised a small, pale hand and pressed it flat against the coarse black bark of the trunk. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, grinding groan that seemed to come from the very roots of the earth, a section of the tree trunk swung inwards. Where there had been solid ancient wood, there was now a rectangle of perfect, yawning darkness, a hidden door. It led down into the ground beneath the tree. Thomas Thatcher, without a moment's hesitation, stepped over the threshold and disappeared into the blackness. "It's a sea." "Ella," Mr. Croft whispered in awe and horror, "her real pantry." They stood at the precipice, the shouts of the posse now entirely gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against their ears. The darkness in the tree beckoned, a place of answers and certain damnation. To turn back now was impossible. They had come too far. Taking a deep, ragged breath, Evelyn, followed by Mr. Croft, descended the steep earthen steps into the heart of the widow's power. The air that hit them was a physical shock. It was cold, but not the clean, damp cold of a normal cellar. This was a dead, ancient cold, thick with the smell of rich soil, of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, and a sickeningly sweet metallic undertone that reminded Evelyn of wilted flowers and old pennies. The darkness was not total. Faint, phosphorescent veins ran through the packed earth walls, casting the entire subterranean chamber in the same ghostly green light they had come to dread. The room was larger than they had expected, circular, with a high, vaulted ceiling supported by the thick living roots of the oak tree above. It was a kiva, a ritual chamber, a stomach in the bowels of the earth, and it was filled with horrors. Shelves carved into the earth were lined with jars, but these did not contain preserves or pickled vegetables. They contained specimens, things floating in murky, glowing fluid. Coils of what looked like pale, fleshy worms, small skeletal animals, their bones reassembled into unnatural shapes, and in one jar, a human heart, pierced through with a long silver pin, still lethargically, impossibly, beating. Hanging from the gnarled roots in the ceiling, like obscene charcuterie, were the humanoid figures. There were dozens of them, in all stages of development. Some were small and pale, barely formed, little more than gnarled tubers. Others were larger, their limbs and features more defined, their desiccated forms disty, urbingly familiar. In the center, hanging like a grotesque chandelier, was a massive one, easily the size of a grown man, its shape horribly defined, and from within its blackened, root-like flesh, a powerful green light pulsed, the clear source of the cellar's illumination. It was the queen bee, the mother root. In the center of the room, directly beneath the mother root, was a large circular stone basin, its surface stained dark with a substance that was not wine. Around it were arranged various implements, silver knives of different shapes and sizes, porcelain bowls, and a set of scales made from bone and sinew. This was the altar. This was the true kitchen. Thomas Thatcher stood before the altar, his back to them, his head tilted up towards the pulsating root above. He was perfectly still, his humming now synchronized with the slow, rhythmic pulse of the light. He had come home. Evelyn felt a wave of vertigo, her mind struggling to process the sheer, blasphemous reality of the place. She stumbled back against a wall, and her hand brushed against a small wooden crate tucked into a recess. Inside, nestled amongst dried, crumbling herbs, was a book. It was not the large grimoire they had seen in the cottage. This was smaller, a simple leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded. The handwriting was cramped, frantic. It was a diary. "My name is Annabel," the first entry read. "My husband was lost to the fever. The widow came. She brought a broth. It eased my sorrow. It eased it so much I have forgotten his face." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. It was a journal from the 1780s, the time of the plague she had read about in the church records. It was the diary of a woman who had slowly, horrifyingly, realized what was happening to her. "She calls me her apprentice," another entry read. "She says the S. Oro has hollowed me out, made me a worthy vessel. She shows me the secrets of the root, the one that sleeps under the old oak. She says it is a god of hunger, and we are its gardeners." The journal chronicled the woman's transformation, how Elara, or the thing that called itself Elara then, had fed her small tastes of the raw root, changing her, preparing her. How she learned that the widow Blackwood was not a person, but a title. A role passed down to a successor every time the current vessel began to fail. The widow was a high priestess, chosen to tend the root, to feed it the sorrows and life force of the villagers, and to prepare the next generation of roots by planting its seeds in the living. "She is weakening," a later entry said, the handwriting growing ragged. "Her body is failing. The root demands a new gardener. She says my training is almost complete. The final rite is tonight. I must consume her heart. I must become the widow. I do not want this. I am not Ilara. I am Annabelle. I am... The final pages were a frantic, incoherent scrawl of the name Annabelle, over and over, a desperate assertion of an identity that was being erased. Evelyn finally understood. They were not fighting a mortal woman. They were fighting an ancient parasitic consciousness, an entity that inhabited a succession of hollowed-out women, a being whose physical heart was the monstrous root that pulsed above them. Ilara was not the monster. She was merely its current face, its gloved hand. As this terrible revelation settled over them, a new sound cut through the silence, a scraping noise from above, from the tunnel. Someone was coming. "She knows we're here," Mr. Croft hissed, pulling Evelyn away from the journal. The boy. He was a beacon. He led her right to us. They were trapped, cornered in the monster's womb, 100 feet beneath the earth. There was no escape. The slow, deliberate footsteps grew closer, echoing down the earthen passage. In a few moments, she would be upon them. Mr. Croft's eyes darted around the room, landing on a set of tools mounted on the wall. Among them was a large, heavy wood-cutting axe, its head polished to a mirror shine. A ritual tool, not a practical one. His face, which had been pale with fear, hardened into a mask of pure, defiant rage. If this was the end, he would not die cowering. He strode across the room and wrenched the axe from its mountings. He turned to face the great pulsating mother root, the heart of the entire horrific organism. "If we die," he growled, his voice a low thunder, "we die on our feet, and we take this hell with us." He raised the axe high above his head, the green light glinting on its silvered edge. He put all of his blacksmith's strength, all of his grief for his daughter, all of his rage at the violation of his town, into one single, desperate blow. He swung the axe directly at the luminous, living heart of the great root. As the axe arced downwards, two things happened at once. The boy, Thomas, who had been standing silent and still, threw his head back and released a scream. It was not the sound of a child. It was a high-pitched, piercing, inhuman shriek that vibrated with the energy of a plucked nerve, a sound of pure, shared agony. And from the tunnel above, from the throat of the approaching widow, came the exact same sound, a perfectly synchronized, unearthly scream of pain, echoing the boy's cry note for excruciating note. He had swung the axe not at a plant, not at a single enemy, but at the central nerve of a monstrous, interconnected trinity. And in that moment, as the blade was about to strike, he learned the final terrible truth of the widow's secret recipe. The gardener, the garden, and the harvest were all the same flesh. What is the sound of a god dying? It is not a clap of thunder or the rending of the earth. It is the shriek of a woman in a tunnel, the scream of a little boy in a cave, and the wet, tearing thud of an axe biting into flesh that is also wood. It is the sound of a single, ancient nerve, stretched invisible across a valley, finally, violently, snapping. The axe struck true. A great, shuddering tremor ran through the mother root, and a geyser of thick, glowing green sap erupted from the wound, spattering the stone altar and Mr. Croft's face with its cold, viscous fluid. The phosphorescence in the cellar flickered wildly, plunging the room into strobing fits of light and shadow. All around them, the smaller, hanging roots began to writhe and twitch in sympathetic agony, a silent, writhing chorus of the damned. The synchronized scream from the boy and the widow intensified for a single unbearable moment, a razor-thin note of pure agony that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. Then, As suddenly as it began, it was cut off, plunging the cellar into a shocking, ringing silence. Thomas Thatcher crumpled to the floor, his small body going limp as if his strings had been cut. The terrible green light at his throat faded to a barely perceptible smouldering ember. In the tunnel, they heard a heavy, ungraceful thud, followed by a ragged, pained gasp. She was down. The witch was down. For the first time, they had drawn blood. The invincible, serene puppet master was mortal after all. The sight of their wounded enemy broke the spell of their terror. A new, feral instinct took over. Survival. "The journal!" Evelyn cried out, her voice sharp and clear in the sudden silence. She scrambled back to the recess where she'd found it, snatching the brittle leather book. It was their only weapon, the only map they had for this nightmare. Mr. Croft pulled his axe from the gash in the root. The wound was weeping sluggishly, the flow of glowing sap already slowing, the flesh-like wood already beginning to curl and close over the injury. It was healing itself. Their window of opportunity was going to be terrifyingly small. "The boy," he grunted, moving to Thomas's side. He scooped the limp child into his powerful arms. Thomas was light, unnervingly so, as if the thing inside him had been consuming his very substance. "We have to go, now," Mr. Croft urged. They plunged back into the earthen tunnel, Evelyn leading the way, clutching the journal to her chest like a shield. As they neared the exit, they saw her. Elara was slumped against the wall of the tunnel, struggling to push herself up. Her serene mask was gone, shattered. Her face was contorted in a snarl of pure, inhuman fury, her grey eyes no longer calm but burning with a cold green fire that mirrored the light of the root. A thin trickle of the same glowing sap oozed from the corner of her mouth. She was wounded, but she was far from helpless. She was a cornered predator, and the look she gave them was a silent promise of a slow and terrible retribution. They burst out of the tree's hidden door and back into the grey morning light, not daring to look back. They could not go back to their hiding place. The posse was too close. The village was a wall of hostility. There was only one direction left, one building that offered even the slimmest hope of sanctuary, however symbolic. "The church," Evelyn gasped, pointing through the trees. "It's consecrated ground, stone walls. We can barricade the doors." It was a desperate gamble, a flight from a witch into the arms of a compromised priest, but the thick stone walls of the old Norman church were a more tangible defence than anything the woods could offer. They ran, crashing through the undergrowth, driven by the knowledge of the wounded, furiots. Thing that would surely be following. They reached the edge of the woods and sprinted across the open space of the churchyard, their feet slipping on the wet grass between the old, tilting gravestones. They half expected the heavy oak doors of the church to be locked, but when Mr. Croft put his shoulder to them, they swung inward with a low groan. The church was empty. The air inside was cold and smelled of damp stone, decaying hymnals, and the faint, lingering scent of Elara's weekly bread offerings. A place of sanctuary, tainted by the very evil they were fleeing. Mr. Croft slammed the doors shut and dropped the heavy iron bar into place. The sound echoed through the nave like the closing of a tomb. They were safe for now, but they were also trapped. He gently laid the now stirring Thomas on a long, hard pew before moving to the tall, arched windows, peering out at the village. Evelyn, her heart still a frantic drum, sank onto another pew, opened the fragile journal, and began to read. Annabel's desperate, looping script was their only hope. She had to find a weakness, a flaw in the monster's design, a way to end the cycle. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. The posse, likely confused by the sudden piercing scream that had echoed from the woods, was regrouping in the square. Shouts and calls carried faintly through the thick stone walls. Mr. Croft gave a low curse. "They see us. They know where we are." Evelyn didn't look up from the journal. Her mind was racing, devouring Annabel's story of her seduction and transformation. She read of the rituals, the strange lunar-timed feedings of the root, the way the widow's consciousness was tied to it. The journal spoke of the root's hunger not for flesh, but for emotion. Strong emotion. Grief was a delicacy. Fear, a savory spice. The blissful, apathetic contentment her cooking induced in the villagers was a form of spiritual predigestion, tender, rising their life force, making it easier for the root to absorb. Outside, the situation was escalating. A crowd was forming, drawn by the posse's shouts. They were gathering at the edge of the churchyard, a confused and fearful mob, and then a figure emerged from the woods. It was Ilara. She was limping slightly, her dress torn, but she had recomposed herself. Her face was once again a mask of serene sorrow. She pointed a slender, accusing finger at the church. "The witch and the madman," her voice carried, clear and melodic, yet laced with a new, sharp edge of command. "They have taken the Thatcher boy. They mean to sacrifice him in their blasphemy. They have barricaded themselves in God's own house." A roar of outrage went up from the crowd. Her words were a spark to the dry tinder of their fear. The posse, now emboldened, began to advance on the church, their rifles held at the ready. John Thatcher was at the front, his face a canvas of righteous fury, his axe held in a white-knuckled grip. The siege had begun. "Evelyn, you need to find something, and you need to find it now," Mr. Croft said, his voice grim as he watched the mob approach. Evelyn's eyes scanned the frantic scrawls of the journal's last pages. Annabel had been searching for a way out, a way to fight back. "The gardener is the weak point," she had written. "The body of the widow is mortal. If it is destroyed, the consciousness must retreat to the heart-root to sleep and heal. It could lie dormant for 100 years. This is the only way, to kill the host, to force the long sleep." But then there was another entry, written on a torn scrap of paper and tucked between the pages, so frantic it was barely legible. It seemed to be a terrible afterthought, a postscript of damnation. "A fail-safe. I heard her whispering to it. If the host is destroyed unexpectedly, before a new vessel is fully prepared, it can attempt an emergency passage. It will not retreat. It will leap. It needs a vessel already tilled, a soul already seeded with its light. It can take root there and burn out the new body quickly. A desperate, short life, but life nonetheless." Evelyn read the passage aloud, her voice trembling. Mr. Croft turned from the window to look at her, his face pale. "A vessel already seeded," he repeated slowly, his eyes drifting down to the small, shivering form of Thomas Thatcher on the pew. As if summoned by their words, the boy began to stir. He sat up. The shivering stopped. He looked around the empty church, his eyes taking in the stained glass windows, the stone altar, the two terrified people watching him. The faint green ember in his throat did not just glow. It blazed, pulsing, with a new and terrifying vitality. The dazed, confused look in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a chilling, sharp intelligence, an ancient, knowing presence. He turned his head and looked directly at Evelyn, a gaze she knew all too well. It was a gaze of calm, absolute superiority. And then, a slow, serene, and utterly monstrous smile spread across the little boy's face. It was not the smile of Thomas Thatcher. It was not the smile of a child at all. It was Ilara Blackwood's smile. The banging on the church doors began, the wood groaning under the assault of the mob outside. But the true threat was no longer outside. They had sought sanctuary in the house of God, only to realize they had locked the doors and trapped the devil inside with them. They had learned that when you wound a serpent, it does not always die. Sometimes when threatened, it simply, horrifically, sheds its skin. How do you fight a monster that looks at you with a child's eyes? How do you raise a hand against a demon that speaks with the voice of a boy you sought to save? The battle for Oakhaven was no longer a siege from without, but a hostage crisis of the soul, staged in the crumbling house of a silent and indifferent god. The banging on the heavy oak doors was a frantic, thunderous drumbeat, the sound of the entire village's fear and rage attempting to break through. But inside the church, a new and more profound terror had bloomed, one that made the mob outside seem like a distant, trivial thing. The boy sat on the pew, the green light in his throat, painting his small, innocent features in a hellish glow, and he smiled Ilara's smile. "Did you truly think?" it began, and the voice was a chilling chimera, the high, reedy pitch of Thomas Thatcher, but laced with the cold, ancient cadence of the widow, "that a little scratch on an old root would be the end of me? This body is a fragile thing, a temporary inconvenience, but it will suffice to see you both broken." Mr. Croft stood between the possessed child and Evelyn, his body a bulwark of muscle and iron will. He held the ritual axe from the cellar, but his hands trembled. How could he use it? How could he swing at the face of the boy he had known since birth? The entity seemed to taste his hesitation, its gaze coming from Thomas's eyes, fixed on the blacksmith. "I know your heart, Jacob Croft. It is a forge full of coals, banked and bitter. All that grief for your little bird, your Clara. She was so full of fire, so much passion. I enjoyed the taste of it as it went out. It was delicious." A guttural roar of pure anguish escaped Croft's throat. He took a half step forward, raising the axe, but Evelyn's hand on his arm stopped him. "Don't," she pleaded. "That's what it wants, to feed on your rage." The entity's smile widened. It turned its terrible, ancient gaze on Evelyn. "The teacher is clever. But you have a hunger of your own, don't you, Evelyn Reed?" "A different kind. A hollow place. You see a monster because you have a hole inside you that you need to fill with purpose. I am your purpose, little teacher. Before me, you were just a lonely woman dying in a forgotten town. You should thank me." The psychological assault was relentless, each word a perfectly aimed dart designed to cripple their resolve. Outside, the rhythm of the attack on the door changed. It was no longer the chaotic banging of fists and rifle butts. It was a heavy, rhythmic, unified thump, thump, thump. They were using a battering ram, a fallen log from the churchyard, likely. The ancient doors groaned, the iron bar shuddering in its brackets. "They are coming for their beloved son," the entity said, its voice full of mocking pity, "and for their beloved widow. My other self is a persuasive thing, is she not? She is telling them you are the source of all their pain, that you must be purged." It leaned forward, its expression turning conspiratorial. "But I can be merciful. This is a tiresome drama. Let me walk out of that door. I will tell them the boy is healed. I will tell them you were confused, mistaken. I will let you take the road out of this valley and never return. A simple choice." It was a tempting lie, a serpent's bargain. But Evelyn clutched Annabel's journal, its brittle pages a talisman against the poison in the creature's words. She knew there was no escape. The entity did not have guests. It had ingredients. "Keep it talking," she whispered to Croft, her eyes scanning the frantic final pages of the journal. "I need more time." Mr. Croft stood his ground, his knuckles white on the handle of the axe. "What are you?" he growled at the thing in the boy. "What do you want, Wit?"
"Is this place?" The entity laughed, a high, tinkling sound from the boy's throat that was perhaps the most obscene thing they had yet witnessed. "Want? A flower does not want, it grows. This valley is my garden. Its people are my soil. I tend to them. I cultivate their little emotions, their griefs, their fears, their fleeting joys, and then I harvest. It is a simple, beautiful cycle. a recipe passed down from ages lost. You are merely weeds, interfering with the crop. As it spoke, Evelyn found it. A new section in the journal, one she had missed in her haste. Annabel had written about her attempts to fight the influence, to starve the seed that had been planted in her. It is a creature of appetite, she wrote. It feeds on strong feeling. Rage is a spice, grief is a wine. But there are flavors it cannot abide. The salt of the pure earth confounds it. The silver of the moon rejects it. It is a parasite, and it cannot comprehend a gift freely given. It cannot stomach a sacrifice made not in fear, but in defiance. Such an offering is poison to it. It chokes on the taste of grace. Salt, silver, sacrifice. The words were a lifeline, a desperate strategy forming in Evelyn's mind. "The vestry," she said to Croft. "The Reverend keeps sacks of rock salt for the winter ice. Find them, now." With a final distrustful glare at the possessed boy, Croft moved, swift and silent, into the small room behind the altar. The entity watched him go, its smile unwavering. Secrets in the house of God. How exciting. Thump. Crack. A long vertical split appeared in the main door. The mob outside roared its approval. Time was running out. Croft returned, dragging a heavy burlap sack. "Here." "Make a circle," Evelyn commanded, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Around the pew where he's sitting. Don't break the line." The entity watched with an air of amuses. Ed Curiosity as the blacksmith, a giant performing a child's ritual, poured a thick, unbroken circle of coarse white salt on the cold stone floor. "A child's superstition," it said, its voice dripping with contempt. "A ring of salt to hold a god? You are more foolish than I thought." Crash! The iron bar on the door bent with a screech of tortured metal. The doors themselves were beginning to splinter from their hinges. In moments, the mob would be inside. Evelyn ignored it all. Her focus was absolute. She looked at the entity, then at the journal, then at the blacksmith. The final ingredient. Sacrifice. Silver. Annabel's words echoed in her mind. She looked at Mr. Croft. "The knife," she said. "The one she left for you on the anvil. Do you have it?" He reached into his coat and produced the small, elegant paring knife, its silver blade gleaming in the dim light of the church. He had taken it as a threat, but now, perhaps, it was a weapon. Boom! With a final explosive crash, the great oak doors burst inward, torn from their ancient hinges. The mob, a wave of familiar, hate-filled faces, poured into the narthex. At their head stood John Thatcher, his face a mask of zealotry, and beside him, leaning on the parson's arm, was the wounded, triumphant Ilara. They stopped, momentarily taken aback by the scene before them. Mr. Croft stood like a colossus, axe in hand, before a barricade of overturned pews. Behind him, Evelyn stood before a child sitting calmly inside a circle of salt. Ilara's eyes, burning with green fire, locked onto the entity in the boy. A silent communication seemed to pass between them, an acknowledgement of the change in strategy. Her smile was one of pure victory. She had them, trapped, cornered, and exposed. The entity in the boy turned its smile on Evelyn. "The game is over, little teacher." Evelyn's face was no longer a mask of terror. It was a canvas of cold, terrible resolve. She took the silver knife from Mr. Croft's hand. She held Annabel's journal in the other, open to the final Esperat page. "Annabel wrote that the seed feeds on our sorrow," Evelyn said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the suddenly quiet church. "She wrote that it savors our fear. But she said there is one offering it cannot stomach." She looked past the boy, past the barricade, her eyes locking with the real Ilara's at the head of the mob.
The entity's serene mask faltered, a flicker of confusion in her glowing eyes. "You want a taste of a soul?" Evelyn continued, her voice rising. "You want a sacrifice to feast on?" She raised the silver knife, its point sharp and impossibly bright. But she did not point it at the boy. She did not point it at Ilara. She held the blade against the pale, soft skin of her own forearm. "Let's see how your god enjoys a meal that is not seasoned with fear," she declared, her eyes blazing with a defiant, holy fire. "Let's see how it chokes on a sacrifice that is offered freely." In the war against a creature that fed on despair, the only weapon left was a strange and terrible kind of hope. The hope that to save one soul, you might have to be willing to spill your own blood on consecrated ground, not as a victim, but as a priestess, making an offering of her own. An angry mob speaks with one voice, the single artless roar of a beast. But a lone, determined woman, holding a silver blade to her own skin, can create a silence so profound it drowns out any noise. In that moment, with the mob poised to strike and the demon smiling in the child's face, the church ceased to be a battlefield. It became an altar. And the sacrifice being offered was not for God, but against the ancient hungry thing that had taken his place. Evelyn did not hesitate. With a steady hand and a will forged in terror and resolve, she drew the silver blade across her forearm. The line of the cut was clean and precise, a stark red declaration against the paleness of her skin. Blood, rich and dark, welled up instantly, a shocking banner of life and pain. A collective gasp went through the mob in the doorway. This was not the act of a cowering witch. This was the cold, deliberate act of a priestess. The effect on the entity was instantaneous and catastrophic. The serene, mocking smile on Thomas Thatcher's face vanished, replaced by a contorted mask of utter revulsion. A strangled, gagging hiss escaped his lips. The thing inside him recoiled from the sight of Evelyn's freely given blood, as if from a white-hot iron. The green light in the boy's throat sputtered and dimmed, the steady pulse becoming a frantic, arrhythmic flicker. It was not a cry of pain, like the one elicited by the axe. It was a shriek of profound, agonizing disgust, as if it had just been forced to taste the most exquisite poison. At the head of the mob, the original Ilara stumbled back, a hand flying to her own chest. Her serene mask shattered. The psychic link that connected the parts of her being had transmitted the poison of Evelyn's sacrifice directly into her own core. A guttural snarl ripped from her throat, her voice losing all its melodic grace, becoming a harsh, rasping sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "Fool!" she shrieked, her eyes blazing with a furious green light. "You ignorant, insignificant fool! You know nothing of the great hunger!" The villagers were frozen, their simple, linear narrative of good versus evil utterly demolished. They had come to destroy a demon, but the woman they had branded a witch was bleeding willingly, and their beloved widow and the boy she was meant to save were the ones writhing in agony. It made no sense. The gears of their collective certainty ground to a halt. John Thatcher stood at the front of the mob, his wood-cutting axe held loosely in his hand, his face a bewildered canvas of confusion. He looked from the calm, bleeding teacher to the hissing, convulsing boy, to the snarling, hate-filled woman he had, moments ago, considered a savior. The spell was breaking. Evelyn saw the confusion. She felt the shift in the air. She pressed her advantage. Ignoring the sting of the cut, she knelt and deliberately pressed her bleeding forearm against the white line of salt on the floor. Her blood seeped into the crystals, turning a section of the pristine circle a damning, vibrant crimson. The effect was amplified. The entity inside Thomas let out a piercing shriek and scrambled backward on the pew, crab-like, away from the tainted barrier, trying to press itself into the far corner of the circle as if to escape a spreading fire. "It's working," Mr. Croft breathed, his eyes wide with a desperate, burgeoning hope. But Evelyn knew it wasn't enough. This was only a repellent. It was not a cure. Annabel's words echoed in her mind. It chokes on the taste of grace. This was not just a ritual of salt and silver. It was a battle of concepts. The entity fed on unwilling suffering. It had to be force-fed a diet of its opposite. She looked at John Thatcher, his face a sea of doubt. She looked at the other Vs, Illigers behind him, their rage now curdled into a fearful uncertainty. And she looked at the creature wearing his son's face, now cowering in the corner. Mr. Croft understood. He was no longer just a guard. He was a witness, a testament. He stepped forward from the barricade, not with his axe raised, but with his hands open. "John!" his voice boomed, the voice of the blacksmith, the voice of a neighbor, a friend. "Look at him! Look at your son! Is that the boy you raised? Or is that the thing that killed your wife?" Ilara, recovering her composure, pointed a trembling finger at Croft. "He is a madman. He lies. Strike him down, John. Avenge your wife. Avenge your son." But her voice had lost its hypnotic power. It was strained, ragged, filled with a desperate fury that the villagers had never heard before. It was the voice of a cornered animal, not a benevolent healer. "She fed you lies, John," Croft continued, his voice ringing with the simple, undeniable power of the truth. "She fed your wife poison, and she fed your heart hatred. But you are a father. Look past the monster. See your son. He is in there. Fight for him." This was the moment, the fulcrum on which the fate of the valley now rested. John Thatcher stood between the command of the witch and the plea of his friend. He looked at Evelyn, bleeding onto the stones of her own free will. He looked at Mr. Croft, standing unarmed before the mob. He looked at the snarling, inhuman face of the woman he had trusted. And finally, he looked at the small, cowering shape in the salt circle, the thing that wore his son's skin. The father's love, an emotion too pure, too freely given for the entity to ever comprehend, was the final ingredient. It was the one offering the creature could not stomach. With a great shuddering sigh, a sound of a lifetime of certainty collapsing, John Thatcher lowered his axe. He did not drop it. He simply lowered it, a quiet, profound act of defiance. The spell was broken. Ilara's primary weapon, the grief of a good man, had just been disarrayed, med. Seeing her control over the mob shatter, seeing the father's will turn against her, the entity made a final, desperate, terrifying gambit. It had lost this battle of wills. It would now default to a battle of pure, raw power. The cowering boy suddenly went rigid. The green light in his throat, which had been flickering and weak, blazed with the intensity of a dying star. A torrent of pure, spectral green energy erupted from his mouth, not a scream, but a silent, cohesive beam of light. It did not strike Evelyn or Croft. It shot across the church and struck the original Ilara square in the chest. She screamed, a true and final scream, her body convulsing as if struck by lightning. The entity was abandoning the boy's failing, poisoned vessel. It was forcibly re-merging with its primary host, consolidating its power, sacrificing the pawn to save the queen. The transfer was not a gentle melding, but a violent, brutal invasion. In the salt circle, the light in Thomas Thatcher's throat went out. It did not fade. It was extinguished, like a snuffed candle. His small body went limp, and he collapsed onto the stone floor, silent and still. He was free. But whether he was alive or dead, no one could tell. But the horror was not over. It was transforming. The Ilara who stood at the head of the mob began to change. The raw, untamed power of the entity, no longer filtered through the careful control of her human consciousness, flooded her mortal form. It was too much. The vessel was breaking. Her serene face melted away like wax held to a flame. Her skin darkened, cracking and hardening, taking on the gnarled, fibrous texture of ancient bark. Her limbs elongated, her joints popping and snapping at unnatural angles. Her fingers grew into long, sharp, root-like talons. The serene grey eyes were consumed, replaced by two solid orbs of blazing, malevolent green light. The human mask was gone, burned away by the raw power she had recalled. For the first time, the people of Oakhaven saw the true face of their gentle widow. She rose to her full height, no longer a woman, but a living, walking effigy of the root god itself, a monstrous hybrid of flesh and wood, of human and unholy plant. The villagers screamed, a true and final scream of terror, stumbling back, their misguided rage replaced with the primal fear of a prey animal facing a predator that has shed its disguise. In its final desperate act, the creature had abandoned its clever subtleties. It could no longer hide in a secret recipe or a whispered lie. The gardener had become the garden, a walking avatar of rot and root, a thing of bark and glowing sap and ancient hunger. And the harvest it now sought was not the gentle reaping of souls, but the bloody, brutal harvest of the flesh. Evil is most dangerous when it wears a beautiful mask, when it whispers comfort and serves you your own damnation in a porcelain bowl. But it is most terrifying when the mask is finally, irrevocably torn away, and the face beneath is not a face at all, but a revelation of jagged bark and burning, inhuman light. The villagers of Oakhaven had come to the church to hunt a witch. They now stood frozen before a god, and its house of worship was about to become a slaughterhouse. The transformed creature, the thing that had been Ilara, did not savor its victory. It did not gloat. The raw, untamed power that now coursed through its new body was a storm of pure, ancient hunger, and it unleashed its fury upon the very flock it had so carefully cultivated. With a sound like the splitting of an ancient tree, it lunged forward. Its first target was the parson, Reverend Michael, the man whose willful blindness had given her sanctuary. He raised a hand, his mouth open in a useless prayer, before a single sweeping blow of a talon-like arm sent him crashing into the stone altar, his spine snapping with a sound like a dried twig. Chaos erupted. The mob, which Seko, aeons before had been a unified instrument of rage, dissolved into a terrified, shrieking herd of individuals. They scrambled back, tripping over one another in a desperate attempt to flee the church they had just broken into. But the monster was impossibly fast. It moved with the unnatural, lurching grace of a great insect, its elongated limbs carrying it across the nave in a few terrifying strides. It fell upon the villagers, no longer a subtle poisoner, but a brutal, physical force of destruction. The church became a canvas of screams and splintering pews. "We have to go!" Mr. Croft yelled, grabbing Evelyn's arm and pulling her from her horrified trance. "The crypt! There's a door in the floor behind the altar!" John Thatcher, his face a white mask of shock and dawning, terrible comprehension, broke from his paralysis. He ran to the pew where his son lay, a small, still form amidst the growing carnage. He lifted Thomas into his arms, his movements now fueled by a father's singular, protective purpose. They scrambled towards the altar, the sounds of the monster's rampage a deafening backdrop of horror. Croft heaved aside a heavy prayer kneeler, revealing a large iron ring set into a stone slab. He pulled, his muscles straining, and with a groan of grinding stone, a section of the floor lifted, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the cold earth beneath the church. "Get in," Croft commanded. Evelyn went first, followed by John Thatcher, carrying his son. A few other terrified villagers, among them a stunned and weeping Martha Gable, scrambled in after them. Croft was the last, pulling the heavy stone door shut, just as the monster's terrible green gaze fell upon their escape route. They were plunged into absolute subterranean darkness, the sounds of the slaughter above suddenly muffled, a distant, terrible echo. They huddled in the cramped, musty crypt, the air thick with the smell of centuries of decay. They were alive, but they were trapped, listening to the muffled sounds of the beast destroying the church above them. It was here, in the suffocating darkness, surrounded by the bones of Oakhaven's dead, that the final, terrible truth was finally told. With Mr. Croft producing a small tinderbox and lighting a sputtering candle, its feeble light pushing back the oppressive gloom, Evelyn opened Annabel's journal, To the small, terrified group of survivors, she began to read. She explained everything. She told them that the widow Blackwood was not a person, but a title, a role. The being they had just seen was an ancient entity, a creature not of flesh and blood, but of root and earth and a consuming, parasitic consciousness. Oakhaven was its farm, its private garden, and they were its crop. She unraveled the secret of the recipe. The food was never meant to nourish. It was a tool of cultivation. It was a sacrament of the earth god, designed to till the soil of their souls. The strange, intoxicating flavors, the blissful apathy it induced, it was all part of a process. The entity was planting tiny psychic seeds of its own essence into them, making their life force, their very emotions, more palatable, more easily digestible. The peace they felt after eating her food was the calm of a fattened lamb, oblivious to the coming slaughter. She explained the widow's motive. It was not hatred. It was not malice. It was simply hunger, the driving, amoral imperative of a life cycle that had been repeating in this valley for generations. The entity fed on the energy of strong emotions, brewing them like a fine tea. Grief was its richest vintage, fear its sharpest spice. This was why it cultivated tragedy, why it sought out the broken and the mourning. It was a connoisseur of human mirth, Siri. The life force it harvested was siphoned off to feed the great heart root that slept beneath the ancient oak, the true physical body of the god itself. And then, Evelyn revealed the most chilling method of all: the children. She looked at the still, pale face of Thomas Thatcher, lying on the cold stone floor. He and others like him throughout the generations were not just victims. They were experiments in propagation. The entity sought to plant not just a psychic seed, but a physical one, a tiny dormant splinter of the heart root to be incubated in the fertile ground of a child's life force. If the incubation was successful, the seedling would grow, transforming the child into a new mobile font of its power, a way for it to finally spread its garden beyond the confines of the valley. Thomas was to be the first successful step in its terrible expansion. Oakhaven was not just its larder, it was its nursery. As the full, monstrous truth settled upon the survivors in the suffocating silence of the crypt, the sounds from above changed. The rampage had stopped. A new sound began, a slow, heavy, dragging sound. The monster was leaving the church, and it was coming for them. "It knows where we are," Martha Gable whispered, her voice trembling. "It can smell us." "Then we don't stay here," John Thatcher said, his voice now cold and hard as iron. He had been broken, manipulated, and turned into a weapon. The grief was still there, but it had been forged into a diamond-hard point of rage. "We end this. For Alice, for my boy, for all of us." They had to get out. Croft, remembering the old layout of the church, knew the crypt had a second exit, a sealed-up tunnel once used for burials that led out into the graveyard. They worked together, their fear giving them strength, and managed to pry the stones away, opening a narrow, crumbling passage back into the night. They emerged into the graveyard, the air tasting impossibly clean and fresh. The village was a patchwork of shadows and silence, but a trail of destruction marked the monster's path from the ruined church. It was moving slowly, deliberately, towards the woods, towards its lair. "What do we do?" a survivor asked, his voice shaking. "We can't fight that thing." "No," Evelyn agreed, her eyes fixed on the distant dark line of the woods. "We can't fight it, but we can fight its heart." She held up Annabel's journal. "The journal says the root is its heart. The host is just its hand. We wounded them both. Now we must kill the heart." A desperate, suicidal plan was born there, amongst the graves.
Annabel's journal had described the root as a creature of the cold, damp, dark earth, a thing of slow rot and creeping growth. Its antithesis, the one thing it truly feared, the one thing that could utterly destroy its ancient, patient life, was fire. Pure, cleansing, all-consuming fire. Their new sanctuary, their final fortress, would be the forge. It was made of stone. It was defensible. And it was the home of fire. They made their way through the back lanes of the silent, terrified village, a small, grim band of ghosts. They barricaded themselves inside the blacksmith's forge. The familiar smells of coal dust and hot metal, a strange comfort. While John Thatcher and the others stood guard, their fear now hardened into a grim resolve. Mr. Croft, the master of the flame, went to work. He stoked the fires of the great forge until they roared, the heat a living, breathing presence in the stone building. He and Evelyn worked by its light, creating their weapons. They were not swords or spears. They were torches, dozens of them, their heads wrapped in oil-soaked rags. They found the blacksmith's stores of blasting powder, used for splitting rock, and packed it into small, tight PT pouches with makeshift fuses. They were no longer victims. They were soldiers, preparing for the final battle of a war they had never known they were fighting. As they worked, the sounds began. The monster was moving through the village, its path slow but unerring. It was hunting them. The sound of a cottage wall being torn away, the distant crash of a roof collapsing, the single, terrified scream that was cut abruptly short. It was coming. Finally, it arrived. A great dark shape blotted out the moonlight outside the forge's main doors. A low, grinding sound filled the air, the sound of stone scraping on stone. It was testing the walls. Then, with a roar that was a symphony of splintering wood and animal rage, it began to tear the heavy forge doors from their iron hinges. Inside, the preparations were complete. John Thatcher and the other survivors stood ready with torches, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. Mr. Croft held the largest torch, its flame burning a greedy, brilliant orange. Evelyn clutched Annabel's journal. This was the end, one way or another. The doors were ripped away, and the monster stood silhouetted against the night sky, a nightmare of bark and vine and burning green eyes. It surveyed the scene, its gaze passing over the men with their torches, over the roaring fire of the forge, and then its eyes, those terrible, luminous green orbs, fixed upon Evelyn. In a moment of terrible, chilling clarity, she understood. The creature's rampage had not been mindless. It was not just hunting them down to kill them. It was here for a reason. It was here for the book, the journal, the single fragile record of its existence, the key to its weakness, the testament that could be used against it again in another generation if it were allowed to survive. "It doesn't want us," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but clear over the roaring of the forge. "It wants this." She held up the journal, its leather cover seeming to glow in the firelight. The monster took a step forward, its attention now completely, hungrily fixed on the book in her hand. The monster took a step forward, its attention now completely, hungrily fixed on the book in her hand. "You have to go," she said to Croft, not taking her eyes off the creature. "You have to get to the tree. Take the powder. John, you and the others, get Thomas away from here. Create a diversion. You have to give him enough time. Go. Now." She knew what she had to do. She was the librarian, the keeper of the truth, and now she was the bait. "I'll lead it away," she said, her voice steady. "I'll lead it back to the clearing." The final recipe had been written, not in a book of shadows, but in the desperate, courageous hearts of the last survivors of Oakhaven. It required 1 part courage, 1 part fire, and 1 final willing ingredient to draw the monster into the trap. The teacher had spent her life feeding knowledge to the children of the valley. Now, to save what was left of it, she would feed herself to the god that had consumed their souls.
All great stories demand a sacrifice, a final, willing payment to close the ledger and settle the accounts of blood and shadow. As Evelyn Reed stood before the monster in the firelight of the forge, the journal in her hand was no longer a book. It was a promise, a contract. The story of Oakhaven would have an ending, written not in ink, but in the ashes of a god. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that the final chapter would be her own. "Yes," she said, her voice a clear, steady bell in the roaring chaos. "This is what you want, isn't it?" She took a deliberate step back, out of the forge and into the moonlit ruin of the village square. "Come and get it." The creature that was Alara let out a low, guttural sound, a noise of pure, obsessive hunger. It ignored the men with their torches. It ignored the fire that represented its doom. Its glowing green eyes were fixed on one thing only, the fragile, leather-bound testament of its own damnation. It lunged, not with the frenzied speed of before, but with the terrifying, deliberate purpose of a predator that has its prey cornered. And Evelyn ran. She fled into the ruined, silent streets of her own village, the heavy thud of the monster's footfalls a relentless drumbeat behind her. She was not a warrior. She was a teacher. Her body was not built for this, her lungs already burning, her legs already aching, but she was fueled by a desperate, defiant purpose. Every step she took was a second bought for Jacob Croft. Every ragged breath she drew was another chance for the valley to be free. Behind her, she heard shouting, a roar of defiance from the forge. John Thatcher and the others, armed with their new, fiery courage, had created their diversion. They stood their ground, a tiny, flickering wall of light, holding back the few remaining villagers still enthralled by the creature's dying influence. They were buying time with their own lives. Evelyn plunged from the relative safety of the village into the absolute darkness of the Whisperwood. The trees closed in around her, their gnarled branches clawing at her face and clothes. The air grew cold, the familiar path now a terrifying, disorienting maze. The monster was faster here. This was its home. She could hear it crashing through the undergrowth behind her, the sound of ancient wood splintering, of great, unnatural strides closing the distance. At the same time, on a parallel path known only to him, Jacob Croft ran with the silent, desperate urgency of a man on a holy mission. In one hand, he carried the great, blazing torch from his forge. In the other, a heavy leather satchel containing the blasting powder and fuses. The woods seemed to fight him, the roots trying to trip him, the air thick and heavy with the creature's malevolent presence. But his every step was powered by the memory of his hollowed-out daughter, of his dead neighbours, of the good woman who was at that very moment sacrificing herself for his chance. Evelyn, with nowhere left to run, held up the journal. Her voice, though ragged and breathless, did not tremble. She began to read from the last page, Annabel's final, defiant scrawl. "My name is Annabel," she cried out into the dead air of the clearing, "and I am not your harvest." As the monster lunged, a great roaring gout of fire erupted from the side of the clearing. Jacob Croft had arrived. He stood like a vengeful god of antiquity, the great torch held before him, keeping the creature at bay. "Now, Evelyn!" he roared. She didn't need to be told. She scrambled to the base of the ancient oak, to the hidden door of the root cellar. Croft had already been there. He had wedged the pouches of blasting powder deep into the cracks around the stone entrance, a long, sputtering fuse already laid. He had been waiting for her, for the bait to draw the monster to the very heart of its own trap. She looked at the fuse. Croft looked at her. The monster, momentarily blinded by the torch, was turning, its inhuman rage now focused on the blacksmith and his fire. This was their only chance. Evelyn took the flint and steel from the satchel, her hands shaking now, not with fear, but with the weight of the moment. She struck the flint. A spark. Another. The fuse caught, a small, fizzing serpent of fire eating its way towards the packed powder. "Jacob, run!" He threw the great torch. It flew in a perfect fiery arc and landed squarely in the gash his axe had made in the mother root deep within the cellar, which was visible through the open door. A great subterranean whoosh of ignited sap and ancient wood echoed from below. Croft grabbed Evelyn, half tackling her, dragging her away from the tree and into the relative safety of the tree line. The monster, seeing the fire at its heart, let out a silent, agonized scream that was not a sound, but a blast of pure psychic energy. It abandoned its attack and scrambled towards the door of the cellar, trying to get to the fire, to the source of its agony. It was too late. The fuse reached the powder. The explosion was not a loud, simple bang. It was a deep, resonant, ground-shaking roar that was both a sound and a feeling. The ancient oak tree seemed to leap into the air, its great trunk splitting apart, a column of green and orange fire erupting from its base, punching a hole into the night sky. The very earth shuddered. The creature was caught in the epicenter of the blast. The raw physical power of the explosion tore through its unnatural form, but it was the destruction of the heart root that truly killed it. A blinding, silent flash of emerald light erupted from the creature's body, and it simply disintegrated. It did not bleed. It did not burn. It crumbled into a shower of black ash, dried leaves, and brittle smoking splinters of root, which were then scattered to the winds by the force of the blast. The great fire of the oak tree burned through the night, a magnificent, terrible pyre for a dead god. As the sun rose, casting its clean, honest light on the valley for the first time in centuries, the survivors emerged. Evelyn, Croft, John Thatcher, carrying his son, and the few others stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the last of the embers die. The oppressive psychic weight that had suffocated Oakhaven for as long as anyone could remember was gone. The air was light. The silence was peaceful. The village slowly came back to life. The people who had been part of the mob awoke in their homes with splitting headaches and hazy, nightmarish memories of anger and fire. Silas Abernathy remained as he was, a man whose mind had been permanently scoured. But in the Croft house, Clara was found staring at her hands, a single confused tear tracing a path down her dusty cheek. A flicker of the girl she had been. And John Thatcher, looking down at his son, saw the boy's eyelids flutter. Thomas was weak, emaciated, but he was breathing. The light was gone. He was just a boy again. The victory was not without its profound scars. Oakhaven was a town of ghosts now, haunted by the friends and family they had lost, and by the terrible knowledge of the parts they themselves had played. The survivors, the small group who knew the whole truth, never spoke of it. The story was too monstrous to be told. In the days that followed, Mr. Croft sifted through the ashes in the clearing. The fire had been absolute, cleansing. But in the very center of the crater where the heartroot had been, he found something. A single, obsidian-black seed-like object, no bigger than a child's fist. It was charred and cracked, but when he picked it up, he could feel a faint, slow, almost imperceptible warmth pulsing within. A single, dormant ember of the great hunger. He did not show it to Evelyn. He did not tell the others. He took it back to his forge. He heated the furnace to a roaring, white-hot intensity. He then melted down every scrap of iron he possessed, and in a great, smoking crucible, he encased the seed in a solid sphere of metal, sealing it away, burying its potential under a weight of pure, unyielding iron. He then buried the sphere deep in the earth beneath his hearth, a final, silent act of guardianship. The legacy of the widow's secret recipe lived on, not as history, but as a dark folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to children. The village never truly recovered its spirit, but it survived. A quiet, watchful place, forever scarred. The people developed a deep instinctual aversion to overly complicated dishes, to overly generous strangers, and no one, not for any reason, ever went near the great blackened crater in the heart of the Whisperwood. They had won. They had cut down the garden and killed the gardener. But the recipe itself, the story of how a seed of hunger can be planted in the fertile soil of human sorrow, could never be truly erased. T. The iron sphere lies buried and sleeping, the curse contained. But the world is full of other forgotten valleys, full of other lonely, grieving people. The hunger is patient, and it knows that all it truly needs is for a new, unsuspecting hand to come along, to unearth the secret, and to begin cooking once more.